Imagine reading a book where angels leave heaven on purpose, walk down a mountain, and start families with human women. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The text says they came down, they saw, they wanted, and they acted. And what came from those unions wasn't ordinary. Giants, creatures so large and so hungry that they began devouring everything around them, including, according to this ancient account, human beings themselves. This isn't some obscure fantasy novel. This is a book that ancient Jewish communities read, copied, and preserved for centuries. A book that early Christians quoted directly. A book that one writer of the New Testament references by name. And yet, if you open almost any Bible sitting on a shelf today, you won't find it. It's just gone, missing, left out. That book is called Enoch. And the mystery surrounding it is honestly one of the strangest stories in the history of religious texts. Here's what makes it so unsettling. This wasn't a fringe document nobody cared about. Fragments of it have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tucked into caves for nearly 2,000 years, waiting to be discovered. Early church fathers argued about whether it was scripture. Entire communities of believers treated it as authoritative. And then, slowly, deliberately, it was pushed to the margins until most of the Western world forgot it ever existed. So what happened? Who were these angels the text calls watchers? And why would ancient writers imagine them abandoning heaven for human women? What exactly were these giants, and how do they connect to the mysterious Nephilim, mentioned so briefly in Genesis that most readers skip right past them without a second thought? Why did some early Christian leaders quote Enoch like it was gospel truth, while others fought to bury it? And how did a small, isolated church in Ethiopia end up being the reason we still have this book at all today? We're going to dig into all of it. The Watchers descending on Mount Hermon, the forbidden knowledge they allegedly taught humanity, the flood that some ancient writers believed was sent not just to punish human sin, but to wipe out something far more dangerous. Enoch's supposed journey through the heavens, encountering angels and structures of the cosmos that sound almost impossible for someone living thousands of years ago to describe. We'll look at the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the debates among early Christians, and the theories, some reasonable, some wild, about why this book was eventually excluded from the canon most of us grew up with. But here's something important before we go further. We're going to be careful to separate what the ancient texts actually say from what later legend, folklore, and modern speculation added on top. There's a lot of internet content out there blending Enoch with ancient astronaut theories and alien conspiracy videos. Some of it's entertaining, sure, but it's not history. Our job here is to walk through the real evidence, the real manuscripts, the real historical debates, and let you decide what you think happened. If you're listening to this late at night trying to drift off, that's exactly what this is for. So go ahead, comment where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing that. Last time it was someone in Lisbon at midnight and someone in Toronto just waking up, all reading the same words at completely different hours. And if you want to support what we do here, the best way is honestly simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there when you can, and if you're enjoying these deep dives, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to where this all begins. A name buried deep in Genesis, mentioned almost in passing, that somehow became the centre of one of the strangest religious controversies in history. Open Genesis and start counting words. Look for Enoch. You'll find him fast because there's almost nothing there. A handful of verses. That's it. That's the entire biblical footprint of a man who would eventually have an entire library of literature attributed to him. A man who ancient communities believed had walked through the heavens themselves and returned with secrets no human was supposed to know. Genesis chapter 5 gives us the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and honestly, most of it reads like a phone book. So-and-so lived this many years and had this son. So-and-so lived this many more years and had other sons and daughters. Then he died, over and over, the same formula, generation after generation. It's the kind of passage most people skim right past on their way to the more exciting parts of the story. But then you hit Enoch, and something shifts. The pattern breaks. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. After that he lived 300 years and walked faithfully with God. And he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. He walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. Read that again. He was no more because God took him. Every other name on that list gets the same ending. He died. Enoch doesn't die, or at least the text doesn't say he died. It says God took him, and that's it. No explanation. No details. No description of what that actually looked like. The narrative just moves on to the next name as if nothing unusual happened at all. But something unusual absolutely happened, at least in the eyes of every reader who came after. Because in a document filled with straightforward, repetitive language about mortality, one man gets a completely different fate. And the phrase "walked with God" appears only twice in the entire book of Genesis. Once for Enoch, once, much later, for Noah. That's a small detail, but it's not nothing. It suggests these two men occupied a special category in the mind of whoever compiled this genealogy. Men who lived differently. Men who had some kind of unusual closeness to the divine that set them apart from everyone else in the family tree. Now, here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Ancient readers, the people actually living in the world that produced these texts, did not read the phrase "God took him" the way a modern reader casually skims past it. To them, this was loaded language. It was the kind of wording used elsewhere for something extraordinary. Think about Elijah, centuries later, who doesn't die either, but is instead swept up into heaven in a whirlwind, witnessed by his own disciple. The vocabulary is different, but the pattern is strikingly similar. A righteous man, a mysterious departure, no body left behind, no funeral, no burial site anyone could visit, just gone. For ancient audiences steeped in a worldview where heaven and earth were not entirely separate, where the boundary between the human and the divine realm could apparently be crossed under the right circumstances, this kind of language practically demanded interpretation. If Enoch's departure was ordinary death, why not just say he died like everyone else on the list? Why use different words? Why break the pattern? The silence itself became an invitation, and ancient writers across multiple centuries and multiple cultures took that invitation and ran with it. This is really the seed of everything we're about to explore in this video. A tiny gap in the text, barely more than a sentence, that later generations filled with an enormous amount of speculation, storytelling, and theological imagination. Because if God took Enoch somewhere, the obvious question becomes, where did he take him? And if Enoch walked with God so closely that he escaped ordinary death, what did he see during that walk? What did he learn? What would a man like that know about the structure of the universe, the nature of angels, the secrets behind human suffering that ordinary mortals couldn't possibly access? This is exactly the kind of question that ancient Jewish writers, working centuries after Genesis was composed, found irresistible. And it's important to understand something here. The Enoch who walks through elaborate visions of heaven, who tours cosmic structures, who receives detailed warnings about rebellious angels and monstrous giants, that Enoch is not simply lifted word for word out of Genesis. That version of Enoch is a literary construction built by writers who took the bare bones of a 5-verse mystery and constructed an entire theological universe around it. The Enoch of Genesis is a name, a lifespan, and a strange departure. The Enoch, who later becomes a heavenly traveller, a scribe of angels, a receiver of forbidden knowledge, that Enoch is the product of imagination working within the gaps the original text left wide open. And honestly, this is a pattern you see again and again in ancient literature. When a text gives you almost nothing about a character, but hints that something extraordinary happened to them, later generations tend to fill that vacuum. It happened with Enoch. It happened with figures in other ancient traditions too. The less information you have, the more room there is for elaboration, and Enoch offered about as little information as a biblical figure possibly could, while still hinting that something significant had taken place. But why Enoch specifically? Why did later writers choose this particular obscure ancestor to become the vehicle for some of the most elaborate, visionary literature in the ancient world? Part of the answer lies precisely in his obscurity. Enoch wasn't a major figure like Abraham or Moses, someone whose life and character were already well defined by extensive biblical narrative. He was essentially a blank slate, a name attached to a genealogy and almost nothing else. That absence of established detail gave writers enormous creative freedom. They weren't constrained by decades of established stories about his personality, his conflicts, his relationships. They had a name, a lifespan, a mysterious ending and open space to build whatever they wanted around it. There's also his position in the family tree itself. Enoch lived before the flood, which made him perfectly positioned to witness, at least in the imagination of later writers, the very corruption that supposedly led God to send that flood in the first place. He was also, according to the genealogy, the great-grandfather of Noah, connecting him directly to the most catastrophic event in the ancient biblical narrative. An ancestor who walked with God, who vanished under mysterious circumstances, and who lived in the generation right before humanity's near-total destruction. That's an almost perfect setup for a story about hidden knowledge, angelic secrets, and warnings nobody heeded in time. So that's the man behind the mystery. A handful of verses, a broken pattern, and a phrase vague enough to launch centuries of speculation. But the real transformation, the Enoch who becomes a cosmic traveller and a keeper of forbidden secrets, that story is still ahead of us. But before we follow Enoch into heaven, we need to clear up one major misunderstanding. When people say, the Book of Enoch, it sounds like they mean one book. One author, one moment in history. One ancient manuscript sitting somewhere with a clean beginning, middle and end. That is not what one Enoch actually is. What we call one Enoch is more like an ancient anthology. A collection of separate writings produced over generations, probably by different authors, then gathered together under the name of one mysterious man from Genesis. Think of it less like a single novel and more like a library compressed into one volume. Different sections have different styles, different concerns, different visions of the universe, and possibly different dates. But they all share one central idea. Enoch, the man God took, had access to knowledge hidden from ordinary human beings, and that idea was powerful enough to hold all the pieces together. The version usually called 1 Enoch contains 5 major sections. The first is the Book of the Watchers. This is the part most people have heard about, even if they do not know its name. It tells the story of angels called Watchers who descend to earth, take human women as wives, teach humanity forbidden arts, and produce giant offspring whose violence fills the world. This is where Enoch becomes a messenger moving between the rebellious angels and the throne of God. It is dark, strange, and probably the section that most shaped the book's reputation. Then there is the Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes of Enoch. This section is filled with visions of judgment, cosmic justice, wicked kings brought down from power, and a mysterious heavenly figure called the Son of Man, or the Chosen One. This is one of the most debated parts of the entire collection, because its language sounds, to many readers, surprisingly close to ideas that would later become central in Christianity. But the relationship is complicated, and scholars still debate exactly when this section was written and how it should be understood. The third major section is the Astronomical book, and despite the name, this is not astronomy in the modern scientific sense. It is an ancient vision of the cosmos as a carefully ordered system created by God. Enoch is shown the movements of the sun, moon, stars, winds, seasons, and gates of heaven. The universe in this account runs according to a divine schedule. The sun does not simply rise because of physics, it enters through appointed gates. The year is not just a cycle of weather, it is a sacred pattern, and getting that pattern wrong has spiritual consequences. Then come the dream visions. Here Enoch receives symbolic dreams that retell history using animals instead of people. Israel becomes sheep. Foreign empires become beasts and birds. Human history turns into a kind of cosmic fable, moving from Adam through the flood, through the patriarchs, through Israel's disasters, and toward an expected final judgment. It is one of the clearest examples of what scholars call apocalyptic literature. History is not random. It may look chaotic from the ground, but from heaven it has a pattern. The powerful may seem untouchable for a while, but their time is measured. And finally there is the Epistle of Enoch, sometimes called the Letter of Enoch. This section reads more like wisdom teaching and warning. It speaks to the righteous and the wicked, condemns injustice, warns wealthy oppressors that judgment is coming, and promises that those who remain faithful will ultimately be vindicated. It also includes the Apocalypse of Weeks, a compressed vision of history divided into symbolic periods of time. Again, the message is the same. The world looks out of control. Evil appears to win. But heaven has not lost track of the calendar. Put all of that together, and you start to see why calling this simply the Book of Enoch can be misleading. You have stories about fallen angels. You have journeys through the heavens. You have calendar systems. You have political criticism. You have symbolic dreams. You have reflections on evil, judgment, death, and the future. These are not all doing exactly the same thing. They are connected by Enoch's name, but they come from a long process of composition and collection. Most scholars believe the parts of one Enoch were written across several centuries, beginning roughly in the 3rd century BCE and continuing into the 1st century CE. That means these writings emerged during one of the most turbulent periods in Jewish history. Empires rose and fell over the land of Judea. First came Persian influence, then the conquests of Alexander the Great, then Greek kingdoms fighting over the region, then the Maccabean revolt, then Roman power. For ordinary people, it must have felt like the world was constantly being reorganized by rulers speaking foreign languages and demanding loyalty. And in that kind of world, apocalyptic writing makes sense. If earthly kings seem corrupt, violent, and impossible to challenge, you imagine a higher court above them. If injustice keeps winning in public, you write about records being kept in heaven. If the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, you insist that history has a judgment waiting at the end of it. One Enoch is not just interested in strange angels because strange angels are entertaining. It is trying to answer a much bigger question. Why is the world so broken, and when will God set it right? But there is another question hiding underneath all of this. Did Enoch himself actually write these books? Almost certainly not, at least not in the ordinary historical sense. The Enoch of Genesis belongs to the distant, legendary world before the flood. The writings collected in one Enoch appeared many centuries later. Their real authors are unknown. Yet they are presented as revelations given to Enoch, spoken by Enoch, or written down by Enoch for future generations. This practice has a name: pseudepigraphy. It means writing under an assumed or revered name. To modern ears, that can sound like a forgery, like somebody was trying to trick readers into believing something false. But the ancient world did not always see it that way. Attaching a text to an ancient figure could be a way of placing it inside a sacred tradition. It could mean, this is the kind of wisdom Enoch would have received, or this message belongs to the stream of revelation associated with Enoch. Sometimes it may have involved claims of genuine authority. Sometimes it was a literary convention. Sometimes, honestly, we cannot know exactly what the author expected readers to believe. But the name mattered. Enoch was the perfect figure for this kind of literature because he existed before the flood. Before Moses, before the giving of the law, before the division of nations. He could be imagined as a witness to the original structure of creation and the first great rebellion against God. If anyone knew what the angels had done, why evil had entered the world, how the heavens moved, and what judgment was coming, it would be the man who had walked with God and then disappeared. Now, one more thing, because this gets confusing fast. When people talk about the Book of Enoch, they usually mean one Enoch. But there are also texts called 2 Enoch and 3 Enoch. These are not simply chapters 2 and 3 of the same book. They are separate works from different periods and different religious environments. 2 Enoch, preserved mainly in Slavonic manuscripts, tells another story of Enoch's ascent through multiple heavens. Its exact date is debated. Some scholars place it around the 1st century CE, while others argue for later dates. It shares themes with 1 Enoch, but it is not a continuation of it. It is its own vision of Enoch's heavenly transformation. Then there is 3 Enoch, a much later Jewish mystical work written in Hebrew, probably centuries after the time of Jesus. In that text, Enoch is transformed into the powerful angel Metatron, a heavenly prince and celestial scribe. That is a very different Enoch from the one in Genesis, and even from the one in 1 Enoch. Same ancient name, entirely different world. So when we enter the Book of Enoch from this point forward, we are entering 1 Enoch, a layered collection of ancient Jewish writings, composed over centuries, attributed to a man who may have left Earth without dying, and built around one explosive possibility. What if Enoch did not just go somewhere? What if he came back with an explanation for why the world had to be destroyed? The answer begins with a mountain, not Sinai, not Zion. Mount Hermon, in the Book of the Watchers, the oldest major section of 1 Enoch. The disaster before the flood does not begin with human beings making a bad choice in a garden. It begins in heaven, or more precisely, it begins when beings from heaven decide to cross a boundary that was never supposed to be crossed. Genesis gives us the bare outline in just a few cryptic lines. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves. Then it mentions the Nephilim, mysterious figures associated with the ancient world, and says that human wickedness became great upon the earth. That is all Genesis tells us. No names, no mountain, no explanation of what the sons of God were, no description of what happened after they took these women. For centuries readers have argued over those few verses. Were the sons of God angels? Were they powerful human rulers? Were they descendants of Seth, the supposedly righteous line of Adam's son, marrying descendants of Cain? Different Jewish and Christian traditions gave different answers. But 1 Enoch chooses one answer, and then takes it further than Genesis ever does. The sons of God were angels, not ordinary angels carrying messages between heaven and earth. These were watchers, heavenly beings assigned to observe the world below. The word itself suggests guardianship. They were supposed to watch, to remain in their proper place, to serve the order established by God. Instead, they looked down at humanity and wanted more than they had been given. According to 1 Enoch, 200 watchers descended in the days of Jared, Enoch's father. They came down upon Mount Hermon, the massive snow-covered mountain range on the northern edge of the land of Israel, near the borders of modern Lebanon and Syria. For ancient readers, Hermon was not some vague fantasy location. It was a real mountain, visible from a vast distance, towering over the surrounding landscape, like a wall between earth and the sky. And that matters. A mountain is where heaven and earth seem to touch. It is the natural place for revelation, covenant, encounter, and worship. But in Enoch, Mount Hermon becomes the site of the opposite. Not a holy meeting between God and humanity, but an invasion. A breach in the structure of creation. Picture what the story is saying. The world before the flood is already fragile. Human beings are multiplying. Civilization is growing. Violence is beginning to spread. And above them, invisible to ordinary eyes, a group of heavenly beings is making a decision that will change everything. Their leader is called Semjaza, sometimes spelled Shemihaza. He is the one who first speaks the dangerous thought out loud. He tells the other watchers that he desires human women. But then he hesitates. Maybe he understands the scale of what they are considering. Maybe he knows this is not a harmless act of desire. He fears that the others will lose their nerve and he alone will bear the punishment. So the watchers make a pact. They swear an oath together on Mount Hermon. Not one angel acting alone, not a momentary temptation, not a romance that got out of control. This is a collective decision. 200 heavenly beings binding themselves to the same rebellion. And the text even gives a grim explanation for the mountain's name. In an ancient wordplay, Hermon is connected to the idea of a curse or ban. They named it that, Enoch says, because there they had sworn and bound themselves with mutual curses. Think about what that means. Each watcher is making sure the others cannot back away. They are locking one another into disobedience. If one of them hesitates later, the oath remains. If one realizes the consequences, it is too late. The group has made rebellion easier by making it shared. That is a deeply human idea, even though the characters are angels. People rarely commit their worst acts in complete isolation. They form groups, they normalize what once seemed unthinkable. They tell each other everyone is responsible, which often means nobody feels responsible. The Watchers do exactly that. They turn individual desire into a conspiracy. Then they descend. And in Enoch's version, what follows is not simply that angels marry women. The Watchers take wives, and those unions produce offspring. Those offspring will become the giants, figures so enormous and destructive that they consume the resources of the earth and eventually turn on humanity itself. But that comes next. Before the giants devour the world physically, the Watchers transform it spiritually and culturally. Because they do not arrive empty-handed. Semjaza is the leader of the descent. But another name becomes even more important in the story, Azazel. Azazel is presented as one of the chief offenders, and his particular crime is not only crossing the boundary between angel and human. He teaches human beings the secrets of warfare. He shows men how to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and weapons of destruction. He teaches the working of metals. He reveals ornaments, cosmetics, precious stones, and techniques for beautifying the body. To a modern listener, that list can sound strange. Why would jewelry or cosmetics be placed in the same category as weapons? But the point is not that ancient writers believed eyeliner was as dangerous as a sword. The point is that Azazel teaches arts that can be used to manipulate, dominate, seduce, and turn human desire into something destructive. Weapons make violence more efficient. Luxury can feed greed. Beauty practices can become symbols of deception, vanity, or social corruption. The Watchers bring knowledge, but it is knowledge detached from wisdom and restraint, and that is one of the most important ideas in the entire Book of Enoch. The problem is not knowledge itself. Enoch is a book obsessed with knowledge. Heavenly knowledge, astronomical knowledge, moral knowledge. Hidden knowledge revealed to the righteous. The problem is forbidden knowledge given at the wrong time, by the wrong teachers, for the wrong purpose. The Watchers are not portrayed as enlightened benefactors helping primitive humanity advance. They are cosmic rebels handing over powers that human beings are not prepared to use. They take what belongs in heaven and introduce it into a violent, unstable world below. That is why this story is much bigger than a tale of angels falling in love with human women. In later interpretations, people sometimes try to soften it into exactly that, a forbidden romance, celestial beings attracted to mortals, a tragic love story with supernatural consequences. But Enoch does not frame it that way. There is no tenderness in the account, no concern for the women's voices, no suggestion that heaven and earth are being united in some beautiful mythic marriage. The language is about taking, swearing, descending, teaching secrets, producing monstrous consequences, and bringing ruin upon creation. This is rebellion against cosmic order. In the ancient worldview behind Enoch, creation has boundaries. Heaven is heaven, earth is earth. Angels have their place. Human beings have theirs. The stars follow appointed paths. Seasons arrive in their order. The universe survives because everything remains within the limits set by God. The Watchers reject that order. They cross from heaven to earth. They abandon their proper station. They create offspring that do not belong neatly to either realm. And they give humanity powers that accelerate violence and corruption. Their sin is not merely sexual, it is a violation of categories, authority, and the structure of reality itself. That helps explain why the punishment in Enoch is so severe. These beings are not treated as flawed humans who made a regrettable choice. They are heavenly guardians who knew better. They saw the divine order from the inside and chose to sabotage it. And suddenly Genesis 6 looks different. Those few verses about sons of God, daughters of men, and Nephilim become, in Enoch's hands, the opening scene of a cosmic catastrophe. Human evil still matters. Human beings will make their own choices, commit their own violence, and fill the earth with blood. But behind the corruption of the world stands an earlier rebellion. Something came down from above. Something taught humanity how to become worse. And on Mount Hermon, 200 Watchers made sure they would fall together. But what exactly did the Watchers teach? The Book of Enoch gives us a list, and it is one of the strangest lists in all ancient religious literature. Not because every item sounds evil to modern ears, but because it reveals what ancient people feared could happen when power moved too quickly into human hands. Azazel taught the making of swords and knives, shields, breastplates, the working of metal. He showed people how to take the hidden materials of the earth and turn them into instruments of war. That may be the most obvious danger on the list. A stone can kill. A wooden club can kill. Human beings did not need angels to invent violence. But metal changes the scale of it. A sharpened blade can cut deeper. Armor can protect the powerful weapons can turn one person, one clan, one king into something more dangerous than everyone around them. Technology does not create the desire to dominate, but it can give that desire teeth, and Enoch sees this happening almost immediately. Once the secrets of metalworking are released, the earth begins filling with blood. Humanity is no longer merely struggling to survive in a difficult world. It is learning how to organize violence, how to arm itself, how to make destruction more efficient. Think about the ancient world this text came from. Most people lived under kings, armies, tribute demands, raiding parties and empires that could appear over the horizon without warning. A sword was not just a tool. It was the symbol of someone who could take what they wanted. Your crops, your animals, your land, your family in that world, the ability to make weapons was tied directly to power. But Azazel does not stop with weapons. He also teaches ornaments, precious stones, dyes, and cosmetics. He reveals ways of adorning the body, especially the use of eye paint. Again, that can sound almost absurd to a modern listener. Swords and eyeliner in the same indictment. Warfare and jewelry treated as part of the same cosmic rebellion. But Enoch is not arguing that beauty itself is wicked. It is describing a world where appearance can become a weapon too. Cosmetics, jewelry, rare stones, expensive clothing. These things could mark status. They could create envy. They could allow the wealthy to display power while everyone else went without. They could become associated with seduction, manipulation, and the endless competition to be seen, desired, and admired. In the ancient imagination, vanity was not just private insecurity. It could destabilize households, communities, and social order. The Watchers are accused of teaching humanity not only how to kill, but how to desire more than it needs. More beauty, more status, more power, more control over other people. And then the list gets even stranger. Other Watchers teach enchantments, the cutting of roots, the breaking of spells, the signs of the earth, the signs of the sun, moon, and stars. One teaches the constellations. Another teaches the courses of the moon. Another reveals what the clouds might mean. This is where the story moves beyond weapons and vanity into the dangerous world of hidden knowledge. To ancient people, the sky was not empty. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars governed seasons, agriculture, travel, festivals, and time itself. If you knew when the rains were coming, when winter would arrive, when to plant, when to harvest, that knowledge could save lives. If you could read the heavens, or claimed that you could, people might believe you could see what was coming before anyone else. And that creates power. Imagine living in a world without weather forecasts, clocks, maps, hospitals, or scientific institutions. Someone tells you they know what the stars are saying. Someone claims they can interpret a dream, break a curse, heal with a root, or reveal the day when disaster will strike. Would you listen? Of course you would. Your survival might depend on it. That is why divination and sorcery appear in Enoch's account. The concern is not simply that people are curious. Curiosity is everywhere in ancient wisdom literature. The concern is that hidden knowledge can become a way of controlling fear. A person who claims access to secrets can command obedience. A ruler can use omens to justify war. A priest can use forbidden rituals to gain influence. A sorcerer can promise protection while creating dependence. Knowledge becomes dangerous when it stops serving life and starts serving domination. And that distinction matters because the Book of Enoch is not anti-knowledge. Not even close. This is a book that sends Enoch through the heavens. It shows him the storehouses of winds, the paths of stars, the gates of the sun, the courses of the moon, and the structure of the cosmic calendar. Angels explain mysteries to him. He is shown secrets that ordinary human beings cannot see. In other words, Enoch's world is full of revelation. The stars themselves are not evil. Astronomy is not evil. Medicine is not automatically evil. Knowing the seasons is not evil. Even the ability to understand hidden things is not necessarily evil. In the Book of Enoch, some knowledge comes from God and is given through faithful heavenly messengers. It reveals order. It teaches human beings that creation is governed by laws, boundaries, and justice. The Watchers offer something different. They do not reveal knowledge in order to bring humanity into harmony with divine order. They reveal it as part of rebellion against that order. They give secret arts to a world already vulnerable to violence, desire, fear, and greed. And according to Enoch, humanity uses those arts badly. That is the real accusation. The problem is not that human beings learned. The problem is that they learned power before they learned wisdom. They learned how to make blades before they learned how to restrain violence. They learned how to read signs before they learned humility. They learned how to beautify themselves before they learned the limits of vanity. They learned how to manipulate the natural world before they learned responsibility for what that manipulation would do. It is an ancient fear, but it does not feel ancient. Every civilization faces the same question in a new form. Just because we can do something, does that mean we should? If knowledge gives us greater power, who decides how that power is used? And what happens when invention moves faster than morality? Enoch's answer is bleak. When knowledge is separated from divine order, it does not liberate humanity. It corrupts it. The text says that people were led astray. They committed godlessness. They became polluted. The earth itself cries out because blood has been spilled upon it. This is important. In Enoch, corruption is not only inside individual hearts. It spreads outward. It damages families, communities, the land, and eventually the entire fabric of creation. Violence becomes normal. Desire becomes endless. The powerful gain new tools. The vulnerable pay the price. And beneath all of it stands the terrible irony of the Watchers. They were supposed to be guardians, observers, heavenly beings who watched over the world below. Instead, they became teachers of ruin. They gave humanity secrets, and those secrets helped turn a troubled world into one that could no longer sustain itself. But the Watchers' teachings were only one part of the disaster. Their offspring were growing, enormous, hungry, and impossible to contain. And soon the giants would make the corruption of humanity look like only the beginning. And this is where Enoch's story becomes truly monstrous. The Watchers do not simply descend, teach forbidden arts, and disappear into the background. Their rebellion produces offspring. The Book of Enoch says the angels took human women as wives, and those unions gave birth to giants. Not symbolic giants, not just powerful kings, not merely a poetic way of saying that ancient people were violent. In Enoch's imagination, these are enormous beings, born from a violation of the boundary between heaven and earth. The Watchers belong in the heavenly realm. Human women belong in the human realm. When those worlds are joined in defiance of divine order, the result is something neither fully angelic nor fully human. Something unnatural. Genesis gives us only a few mysterious lines. In Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God see that the daughters of men are beautiful, take wives, and then the Nephilim appear on the earth. The passage is short, almost frustratingly short. It does not explain exactly who the sons of God are. It does not clearly spell out whether the Nephilim are their children, and it does not tell us very much about what the Nephilim actually did. That silence created centuries of argument. Some interpreters said the sons of God were angels. Others said they were human rulers, royal tyrants, or the descendants of Seth, the supposedly righteous line of Adam's son. Even the word Nephilim is debated. It may be connected to a Hebrew word meaning fallen ones, though scholars do not agree on every detail. But Enoch takes one interpretation and runs with it. For Enoch, the sons of God are the Watchers. The Watchers are angels. Their unions with human women produce giant offspring. And those giants are not mysterious background figures mentioned in passing. They are one of the central reasons the world collapses into violence before the flood. This is Enoch filling in the blank spaces of Genesis. And the picture it paints is horrifying. The giants grow until they consume everything around them. Enoch says they devour the labour of human beings. In other words, people work the fields, raise animals, gather food, build communities, and the giants consume the results. They become a burden so massive that ordinary human life cannot support them. At first, you can picture it as exploitation on an impossible scale. Imagine a village trying to survive on a harvest that barely lasts through the year. Then imagine beings so huge, so hungry, so demanding that they can eat what whole communities need to live. Grain disappears, livestock disappears, food stores vanish. Human labour becomes fuel for creatures that never seem satisfied. But the hunger does not stop there. According to Enoch, when the giants can no longer get enough from human beings, they turn on animals. They devour birds, beasts, reptiles and fish. They begin consuming the living world itself. And when even that is not enough, the story becomes darker still. The giants turn against humanity. They eat human flesh. They drink blood. This is one of the most vivid and disturbing parts of the Book of Enoch. The text is not subtle. It wants you to feel that the world has become unlivable. The giants are not just large, they are appetite without limit, hunger without restraint, power without conscience. And that matters because Enoch's giants are more than monsters in a fantasy story. They represent what happens when power breaks free from every boundary. The Watchers brought secret knowledge, weapons, sorcery, techniques of domination. Then their offspring embody the final result. A world where the strong consume the weak, where the powerful take more than they need because they can. Where violence does not remain a human problem, but becomes woven into the structure of creation itself. The giants do not build, they consume. They do not protect, they devour. They do not rule with justice, they turn the earth into a feeding ground. And eventually, even heaven hears the cries. Enoch describes the earth itself crying out because of the bloodshed. This is an important ancient idea. The land is not passive. It remembers violence. Blood spilled on the ground is not forgotten. The suffering of the innocent rises upward as an accusation against those who caused it. In Genesis, the flood comes after God sees that human wickedness has become great upon the earth. In Enoch, that same catastrophe has a much wider cause. Humanity is corrupt, yes, but humanity is also trapped in a disaster unleashed by rebellious heavenly beings and their giant children. The earth is drowning in the consequences. Now, there is one detail in Enoch's giant tradition that became especially influential in later Jewish and Christian thought. It explains something the brief Genesis story never explains at all. What happened to the giants after they died? According to the Book of Enoch, their bodies are destroyed, but their spirits remain. Because the giants were born from heavenly watchers and earthly women, they are portrayed as having a strange mixed nature. Their physical bodies come from the earth, but something in them comes from the rebellious angels. So when their bodies perish, their spirits do not simply go quietly into the realm of the dead. They become evil spirits on the earth. This is one of Enoch's most important contributions to ancient ideas about demons. The Watchers are imprisoned for their rebellion. They are bound and await judgment. But the spirits of their dead giant offspring remain active. They afflict humanity. They corrupt. They attack. They lead people astray. They bring suffering, violence, and disorder. In this tradition, demons are not fallen angels exactly. They are the surviving spirits of the giants. That idea is not stated in Genesis. It comes from Enoch and related ancient traditions, and it helped shape the world behind later Jewish writings and early Christian texts, where demons appear as hostile spirits wandering through the human world. But this is also where we need to be careful. The Book of Enoch is not one smooth single narrative written at one moment by one author. It is a collection of ancient works preserved most fully in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, with portions of some sections surviving in Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That means wording can vary between manuscripts and translations. For example, many English translations say the giants were 3,000 ells tall. An ell is a measure based roughly on the length of a forearm. Taken literally, that would make the giants absurdly enormous, far beyond anything physically imaginable. Some scholars think the number may reflect textual corruption somewhere in the long transmission of the book. Others think it is intentional exaggeration, the kind of cosmic scale ancient apocalypse loves to use. Either way, the point is clear. These are not ordinary warriors who happen to be tall. They are beings beyond proportion, beyond control, beyond the ability of human society to contain them. And some details people associate with the Nephilim come from later traditions, not directly from Enoch or Genesis. Stories about specific giant clans, giant skeletons, secret bloodlines, or surviving Nephilim after the flood often combine biblical passages with much later folklore, medieval interpretation, or modern speculation. Ancient texts do mention figures like the Anakim and Rephaim in other contexts, but turning all of those references into one simple story about a continuous race of angel-human hybrids goes far beyond what the earliest texts actually say. Enoch gives us something stranger than a straightforward history. It gives us a mythic explanation for why violence feels bigger than human beings, why evil seems to outlive the bodies that created it, why the world can become so corrupted that ordinary reform no longer seems enough. The giants are the visible nightmare. Their hunger strips the earth bare. Their violence fills it with blood. But when they die, the nightmare does not end. It changes form, and that is what makes Enoch's version so terrifying. The giant bodies can be destroyed. The rebellious watchers can be bound. But the damage they unleashed continues to move through the world, invisible now, searching for new victims. By the time the flood arrives, it will not be just a judgment on human wrongdoing. It will be an attempt to cleanse a creation overwhelmed by a rebellion that began in heaven, took flesh on earth, and left something dark behind. By the time Enoch reaches the flood, the problem is no longer simply that people have become sinful. The whole world has been infected. Human violence is everywhere. The knowledge given by the Watchers has been used for war, manipulation, and corruption. The giants have consumed the resources of the earth, then turned on the creatures around them, then on human beings themselves. Blood cries out from the ground. The order of creation has been broken at every level. So in Enoch, the flood is not just a human disaster. It is a cosmic intervention. Genesis tells the story with terrifying economy. God sees that human wickedness is great, that the thoughts of the human heart are continually bent toward evil. The earth is filled with violence. God decides to send a flood. Noah finds favor, an ark is built. The waters come. That is the basic outline most people know, but Enoch opens up the background behind it. It asks a question Genesis leaves mostly unanswered. How did the world become so corrupt so quickly? What happened between the creation of humanity and the moment when the earth became full of violence? Enoch's answer is startling. A rebellion in heaven spilled into the human world. The Watchers did not merely commit a private sin, they crossed a boundary that held the universe together. Heavenly beings abandoned their appointed place. They took human wives. They passed down knowledge that humanity was not prepared to handle. And through their giant offspring, their rebellion became physical, public, and catastrophic. This changes the meaning of the world before Noah. In Genesis, the earth is violent because human beings are violent. In Enoch, human beings are still responsible for their actions. They learn forbidden arts. They make weapons. They embrace corruption. But they are also living inside a crisis unleashed by beings more powerful than themselves. The human world has been invaded by a heavenly revolt, and heaven does not ignore it. Enoch describes great angels looking down upon the earth and seeing what has happened. The names vary across ancient traditions and translations, but the major archangels are there. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel. They see the bloodshed. They hear the cries of those destroyed by the giants. They see that the Watchers have revealed mysteries that were never meant to be placed in human hands, and they bring the case before God. This is one of the most dramatic scenes in the book because it presents the flood almost like a trial. The earth itself is the victim. The Watchers are the accused. Their offspring are the evidence, and the verdict is not delayed forever. Each major figure in the rebellion receives a specific judgment. Azazel, the Watcher associated with forbidden arts, weapons, and corruption, is ordered to be bound. In Enoch, Raphael is told to seize him, cast him into a desolate place, and cover him in darkness until the day of final judgment. The language is harsh and physical. Azazel is not gently corrected. He is imprisoned. The other Watchers are also condemned. Michael is commanded to bind them beneath the earth for a vast period of time, until the day when their rebellion will be judged completely. They are forced to witness the destruction of the offspring they created. The beings who descended to earth because they desired human life are now denied freedom in both heaven and earth. Then there are the giants. Gabriel is sent against them. But the judgment is not described as a simple execution from above. The giants are driven into conflict with one another. Their endless appetite turns inward. Their violence consumes them as surely as it consumed everything else. It is a grim symmetry. They devoured the earth, then they help destroy each other. Only after this cosmic rebellion is addressed does the flood arrive as the final cleansing of the corrupted world. The waters are not aimed at one guilty village or one generation of violent rulers. They wash over an earth that has become unrecognizable from the world it was meant to be. That does not make the flood easier to understand. If anything, Enoch makes it more disturbing. The catastrophe becomes larger, stranger, and harder to reduce to a simple lesson about morality. This is not just people did bad things, so they were punished. This is creation in crisis. Heaven has been violated. Earth has been ravaged. Human society has been corrupted by knowledge, violence, and monstrous power. The natural world has been consumed. The boundary between divine beings, human beings, animals, and spirits has been torn apart. The flood is portrayed as an attempt to restore those boundaries. And right in the middle of that coming judgment stands Noah. In Genesis, Noah is introduced calmly. He is a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He walks with God. The story moves quickly toward the ark. But Enoch preserves a much stranger tradition about Noah's birth. In the final chapters of 1st Enoch, Noah's father, Lamech, sees his newborn son and is terrified. The child appears extraordinary. His body is described in radiant, almost angelic terms. His eyes illuminate the house. He seems to speak praise to God from the moment he is born. Lamech panics. He fears that this cannot be his child. He wonders whether Noah might be the offspring of the Watchers, another being born from the forbidden union between angels and women. And considering what the Watchers have done to the world, this is not a casual family suspicion. It is a question loaded with dread. Has the corruption reached even this family? Lamech goes to Methuselah, Noah's grandfather. Methuselah, unable to settle the matter himself, seeks out Enoch, who in this tradition has been taken away from ordinary human life and knows the hidden decrees of heaven. Enoch's answer is reassuring, but ominous. Noah is truly human. He is not the child of a watcher, but he has been set apart because a great destruction is coming. The earth will be cleansed because of its corruption, and Noah will survive. Through him a new beginning will come. That tradition does something fascinating. It turns Noah into more than the righteous builder of an ark. From birth, he is a sign that the old world is ending. His unusual appearance is not proof that he belongs to the corruption. It is a signal that he has been chosen to outlive it. And Enoch's heavenly messages make Noah's role even clearer. God sends Uriel to warn him about the coming deluge. Noah is told that destruction is approaching and that he must preserve life through the judgment. The ark is still central, the animals are still preserved. The waters still cover the earth. But now the ark is not merely a rescue vessel in a story of human sin. It is a protected remnant in a war to reclaim creation from cosmic disorder. That is the major difference between Genesis and Enoch. Genesis gives the flood narrative in a concentrated form. It focuses on God, Noah, the ark, the animals, the waters, and the covenant that follows. It says enough to make the mystery felt, but it leaves enormous spaces around the events. Who are the sons of God? What are the Nephilim? Why does violence seem to erupt with such force before the flood? Enoch fills those spaces with watchers, giants, angels, prisons beneath the earth, and a heavenly court responding to cries from a ruined world. Whether someone reads that as literal history, ancient myth, theological imagination, or a mixture of all three, its purpose is clear. Enoch insists that evil is not small. It is not only personal weakness, not only bad choices made in isolation. It can become systemic. It can spread through knowledge, power, appetite, and violence until entire societies no longer recognize the difference between what is possible and what is permitted. And when that happens, Enoch says, the consequences do not remain on earth. They reach heaven. But the flood does not end every danger unleashed by the watchers. The giant bodies are gone. The watchers are bound. Yet, according to Enoch, their wandering spirits remain. The waters cleanse the world. They do not erase the war behind it. And that is where Enoch himself becomes more than a distant ancestor in a genealogy. He becomes a traveller. Genesis gives us only one mysterious sentence. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. But first Enoch takes that sentence and opens it like a door. Enoch is carried beyond the ordinary human world. Angels guide him through places no living person is supposed to see. He is shown the hidden machinery of creation, the prisons prepared for rebellious beings, the paths of the stars, the chambers of the winds, and the places where the dead wait for judgment. He is not presented as a scientist in the modern sense. He is not travelling through outer space in a machine, measuring planets or mapping galaxies. That is not what this vision is trying to do. Enoch is seeing the universe as ancient people imagined it, a world with layers, boundaries, gates, storehouses, heavenly regions above, depths below, and forces of nature controlled by divine command. And every part of it has meaning. The rain does not simply fall. It comes from storehouses. The winds do not blow at random. They emerge through appointed gates. The sun and moon do not wander freely across an empty universe. They follow ordered paths established from the beginning. To modern readers, this can sound strange. We know clouds, atmospheric pressure, gravity, orbital mechanics. We do not picture snow stored in a heavenly chamber or stars passing through gates in the sky. But Enoch's visions were never meant to be a modern astronomy textbook. They are trying to answer a much deeper question: is the universe chaotic? When violent people prosper, when monsters devour the weak, when the Watchers rebel and heaven itself seems compromised, does that mean creation has no order at all? Enoch's answer is no. The earth may look like a place of confusion, but behind the visible world is a hidden structure, and that structure is not broken. Picture Enoch being led to the edges of the inhabited world. He sees mountains that rise like impossible pillars. He sees deep ravines and terrifying places of darkness. He sees fire moving through the heavens. He sees regions where angels guard secrets that human beings were never meant to control. At one point he comes to a place of imprisonment. There he sees stars bound in darkness, held like prisoners because they did not follow the command given to them. This is one of the book's most unsettling images. In ancient thought, stars could be understood not merely as distant objects, but as heavenly beings or signs of heavenly powers. Their rebellion is described in the same language used for the Watchers. They left their appointed order, and now they are held until judgment. The point is not that ancient writers had discovered literal imprisoned stars somewhere beyond the sky. The point is cosmic obedience. Even the powers of heaven have limits. Even beings associated with the stars are accountable. Nothing is so high that it escapes judgment. That would have mattered enormously in Enoch's world. The Watchers had come down from heaven. They had broken the boundary between realms. Their knowledge had empowered violence. Their children had ravaged the earth. If beings from heaven could rebel, then what could possibly be trusted? Enoch's vision answers that fear. The rebellion is real. But it is not ultimate. The Watchers are powerful, but they are not in control. Then Enoch is shown the places prepared for the dead. This part of the journey is especially important because it deals with one of the oldest human questions. What happens when the wicked die? What happens when the righteous die? Do they all vanish into the same silence? Do murderers and victims receive the same ending? In one vision, Enoch sees hollow places within a great mountain. These chambers are separated from one another. The spirits of the dead wait there, divided according to their lives and their destinies. The righteous are not simply thrown together with the violent. Those who suffered injustice are not forgotten. The blood of Abel, murdered by his brother Cain, is still crying out. That image connects directly to the world before the flood. The giants consumed human beings. The Watchers corrupted the earth. Violence filled the land, and for the people crushed beneath that violence, Enoch offers a terrifying promise. Their cries were heard. Justice may be delayed. It may remain invisible for generations. But it has not disappeared. Enoch also sees mountains of precious metals and strange materials: gold, iron, copper, silver, substances that human beings turn into wealth, weapons, status, and power. In the book, these materials are not evil by themselves. But Enoch has already shown what happens when knowledge of metalworking becomes tied to war and domination. So the vision turns the landscape itself into a warning. The earth contains riches, but riches can become instruments of destruction. Human beings can take what was meant for use and turn it into a system of greed. They can take knowledge and turn it into control. They can take beauty and turn it into vanity. They can take strength and turn it into violence. That is why Enoch's universe is so ordered. Boundaries matter. There are gates for the winds, gates for the sun, gates for the moon, places for the waters, paths for the stars. Seasons arrive according to laws that do not change because a king wants them to change, or because a warrior has conquered his enemies. Creation has an appointed pattern, and humanity suffers when it tries to live as though no pattern exists. But Enoch is not only shown prisons and judgment sites. He is also brought into places of overwhelming beauty. He sees a great tree with fragrance beyond anything found on earth, reserved for the righteous in the age to come. He sees landscapes where the curse of violence will not last forever. He sees signs that judgment is not merely about punishment. It is about restoration. The world was made with order. Evil distorts that order. Judgment removes what destroys it. And beyond judgment, Enoch sees the possibility of a creation made whole again. That is why he becomes a heavenly scribe. He does not just witness these things and keep them to himself. He is told to record what he has seen, to carry the message back, to warn the watchers, to speak to human beings, to preserve the hidden vision for generations that have not yet been born. Enoch sees what lies behind the visible world, then returns with a message for those still trapped inside it. The universe is larger than human violence. The guilty are not beyond judgment. The dead are not forgotten. And the apparent chaos of history is not the final shape of reality. But if Enoch's journeys reveal that evil will be judged, they also raise an even darker question. What exactly became of the evil unleashed by the giants after their bodies were destroyed? According to Enoch, the answer is not comforting. According to 1st Enoch, the giants did not simply die and disappear. Their bodies were destroyed in the judgment that followed their violence. But their spirits remained, and this is where the book gives one of its most influential and most disturbing explanations for the presence of evil in the world. The Watchers were angels, heavenly beings who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. They came down, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and helped create the catastrophe that led to the giants. But the giants were something different. They were born from the union between heaven and earth, part angelic, part human, but belonging fully to neither realm. And because of that mixed origin, 1st Enoch says that when they died, their spirits had nowhere proper to go. They could not return to heaven. They were not simply gathered with ordinary human dead. So they remained on earth. In Enoch's account, these disembodied spirits become the evil spirits that afflict humanity. They attack, they deceive, they bring sickness, violence, grief, and temptation. They move invisibly through the human world, continuing the destruction their giant bodies had begun. It is a remarkably elaborate answer to a question that must have haunted ancient people. Why does evil seem so persistent? Why can violence survive even after violent rulers die? Why do corruption and cruelty keep returning, generation after generation, even when the people responsible are gone? Enoch's answer is not that every human problem comes from demons. The book still holds human beings responsible for their choices. Human kings become arrogant. Human communities embrace violence. Human beings use forbidden knowledge for greed, warfare, and exploitation. But Enoch adds another layer to the story. There are hostile forces in the world, forces that are older than any living human generation, forces born from an ancient rebellion against the order of creation itself. And they are still active. This distinction matters. The Watchers are not demons in the later popular sense. They are rebellious angels. They began in heaven. They possessed knowledge, power, and responsibility. Their sin was deliberate. They abandoned their proper place, corrupted humanity, and violated the boundaries established by God. For that rebellion, they are bound and await final judgment. Their punishment is severe because their responsibility was severe. They were supposed to watch. Instead, they participated in the destruction. The spirits of the giants, however, are presented differently. They are the aftermath, the lingering pollution left behind by the Watcher's crime. Their bodies are gone, but their destructive influence continues. Think about the logic of it. The flood destroys the giants. The Watchers are imprisoned. The earth is cleansed through judgment. And yet evil has not vanished. Human beings still lie, still kill, still worship power, still suffer from forces they cannot see or control. So Enoch explains the world after the flood, as a world still haunted by what happened before it. That idea became enormously important in later Jewish thought. But it was not the only way the Hebrew Bible had spoken about evil. In much of the earlier Hebrew Bible, the spiritual world is less developed, or at least less clearly organized. Angels appear as messengers of God. They deliver warnings. They protect people. They carry out judgment. Sometimes they are terrifying. Sometimes they seem almost human. But they are usually servants within God's authority, not independent rivals battling heaven for control. Even Satan in the Book of Job does not yet appear as the all-powerful enemy of God familiar from much later tradition. He appears more like an accuser within the heavenly court. He challenges Job's motives, but he acts only within limits God permits. The older biblical picture is not simple. There are harmful spirits. There are mysterious heavenly beings. There is the serpent in Eden, a figure later readers would connect with Satan. There are the strange sons of God in Genesis 6. But first Enoch takes these scattered threads and weaves them into a far larger story. Now the sons of God are the Watchers. Their descent explains the corruption before the flood. Their forbidden teachings explain how human violence became organized, weaponized, and amplified. Their giant offspring explain why the world became overwhelmed by destruction. And the spirits of those dead giants explain why evil continues after the flood. It is almost like Enoch is constructing an ancient history of the invisible world. Not just, why do people do bad things, but where did the pressures toward destruction come from? Why does evil feel bigger than any one person? Why does it seem embedded in the very structure of human history? For communities living through invasion, occupation, political betrayal, and religious conflict, that framework could be powerful. It said the world's darkness was real. It was not an illusion. The righteous were not foolish for feeling surrounded by forces beyond their control. But it also said those forces had limits. This is crucial. First Enoch has dramatic angelology. Rebellious angels descend from heaven. Giants consume the earth. Demonic spirits roam after death. Heavenly prisons hold disobedient powers until the day appointed for them. But God is never displaced from the center of the story. The Watchers do not overthrow heaven. They do not create a rival kingdom equal to God's kingdom. They are judged. The giants do not devour the world forever. They are destroyed. The evil spirits may afflict humanity for a time, but their time is not unlimited. Their existence is temporary, their power is restricted, and their final outcome is already known to the God who set the boundaries of the universe. That is the deeper purpose behind all the terrifying details. Enoch is not saying that evil wins because it is supernatural. He is saying that evil is supernatural, human, ancient, and deeply rooted. But it is still accountable. That message helped shape the imagination of the Second Temple period, the centuries before and during the rise of early Christianity. Jewish writers were wrestling with a difficult reality. If God is just, why does the world remain so violent? Why do foreign empires crush the vulnerable? Why do wicked people prosper while the righteous suffer? The Enochic tradition offered a cosmic answer. The conflict was larger than politics, larger than one corrupt king, larger than one generation. Human history was entangled with an older rebellion. But judgment was coming, not only for human oppressors, but for the spiritual powers behind corruption itself. And once that idea entered the bloodstream of Jewish thought, it was hard to ignore, because it changed how people read Genesis, it changed how they understood demons, and it changed how they imagined the final judgment of heaven and earth. And that brings us to one of the most important discoveries in the history of ancient religious texts. Because for centuries, many people in Europe knew the Book of Enoch only through rumours, quotations, and one surviving complete version preserved in the ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. That made the book seem distant, exotic, maybe late, maybe legendary, maybe a strange work that had developed far away from the world of ancient Judaism. Then, in the caves near the Dead Sea, the ground gave up its evidence. In 1947, manuscripts began to be discovered near the site of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. What started with fragments found in a cave became one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. Over the following years, researchers recovered thousands of manuscript fragments from 11 caves. There were biblical books among them, copies of Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and many others. But there were also texts that most modern Bible readers had never heard of, rules for a desert community, commentaries on scripture, hymns, apocalyptic visions, calendrical writings, stories about angels, demons, judgment, and the end of the age. And among those battered, crumbling fragments were pieces of the Book of Enoch. Not one complete scroll, nothing that convenient. Instead, scholars found portions of multiple Enoch manuscripts copied in Aramaic, the language spoken widely across the Jewish world in the centuries before and during the time of Jesus. This changed everything. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest complete copies of First Enoch were Ethiopian manuscripts copied many centuries later. The full book survived, but the surviving manuscripts were medieval. That left enormous questions. How old was the text really? Had it changed dramatically over time? Was it ever known in its original Jewish setting? The Qumran fragments gave a powerful answer. Yes, Enoch was known in ancient Jewish circles long before Christianity. It was copied, read, and preserved in the Second Temple period, the same broad world that produced groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, revolutionary movements, and eventually the earliest followers of Jesus. Some of the Enoch fragments found at Qumran may date as early as the late 3rd or early 2nd century before Christ. The exact dates and the dates of composition remain debated. A manuscript tells you when a copy was written, not necessarily when the original book was first composed. But even with that caution, the implication is massive. The Book of Enoch was not a medieval invention. It was not a late Christian fantasy inserted into Jewish tradition. It was already circulating in Jewish communities centuries before the New Testament was written. Think about what that means. The stories of the Watchers descending from heaven, the giant offspring consuming the earth, the imprisoned angels awaiting judgment, the spirits of the dead giants becoming hostile powers, the journeys through heavenly places, the visions of cosmic judgment. These ideas were in circulation in the ancient Jewish world, not necessarily accepted by every Jew, not necessarily treated as scripture by every community, but known, copied, discussed, important enough that people put ink to parchment, copied the words by hand, and carried them into the desert. At Qumran, scholars found Aramaic fragments from several major sections of First Enoch. There are portions connected to the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. They also found fragments of the Book of Giants, another ancient work closely connected to the Watchers' tradition. That last detail is especially revealing. The Book of Giants expands the same terrifying universe. It tells of enormous beings, ominous dreams, judgment, and Enoch as a figure who interprets heavenly warnings. It does not survive complete, but its fragments show that Enoch was not just one isolated book. It was part of a whole stream of ancient Jewish imagination. A literary world where the events of Genesis 6 were not a tiny mysterious footnote. They were the beginning of a cosmic catastrophe, and the community associated with Qumran seems to have been deeply interested in exactly these kinds of questions. They wrote about angels, they wrote about demons and spiritual warfare. They expected a coming judgment against the wicked. They believed history was moving toward a decisive confrontation between light and darkness. They were intensely concerned with calendars, sacred times, purity, obedience, and the proper order of heaven and earth. That does not mean every person at Qumran believed every line of 1st Enoch in exactly the same way, and we should be careful here. The Dead Sea Scrolls tell us much about the library found at Qumran, but scholars still debate precisely who collected all the manuscripts and how representative that collection was of Judaism as a whole. But the pattern is hard to miss. The Enochic material fits the world of the scrolls, a world obsessed with divine order, a world convinced that corrupt powers had taken control of the present age, a world waiting for heaven to intervene, a world where calendars mattered because time itself belonged to God, a world where angels were not decorative figures in the background. They were part of the structure of reality, but the scrolls also require us to be precise. They prove ancient circulation. They prove that major portions of Enoch existed in Aramaic long before the surviving Ethiopic manuscripts. They show that the book, or collection of books, belonged to the intellectual and religious world of Second Temple Judaism. They do not prove that every later interpretation of Enoch is correct. They do not prove that the Watchers were literal extraterrestrials. They do not prove that giants were prehistoric creatures hidden in the fossil record. They do not prove that every later demonology, conspiracy theory, or prophecy system can be traced directly back to Qumran. Ancient texts need to be read in their ancient context. And in that context, Enoch looks less like a forgotten oddity and more like a major voice in a larger conversation. A conversation about Genesis, evil, suffering, angelic rebellion, human corruption, and the judgment still to come. Before Qumran, scholars could debate whether 1st Enoch was a late work preserved at the edge of Christian tradition. After Qumran, that argument became much harder to make. The fragments were physical proof, small scraps of parchment, faded Aramaic letters, broken lines rescued from desert caves. But together they carried an enormous message. The Book of Enoch had been there all along, in the ancient Jewish world, near the centre of debates about heaven, earth, angels, evil, and the fate of humanity. And it was not only read by isolated mystics in a cave. Its ideas reached much farther. They would echo in other Jewish writings. They would shape the language of judgment and angels. And they would appear, sometimes unmistakably, in the world of the earliest Christians. And nowhere is that connection clearer than in one short, explosive passage from the New Testament. The letter of Jude is only 1 chapter long. It is easy to miss. Tucked near the end of the Christian Bible, just before Revelation, it contains a warning against corrupt teachers, rebellious angels, and a coming judgment. Then Jude says something remarkable. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them, and he gives a prophecy. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds. The wording is strikingly close to 1st Enoch chapter 1. In Enoch, the Lord comes with countless holy ones to bring judgment on the wicked. The language, the structure, the theme, even the repeated emphasis on ungodliness, all line up so closely that most scholars agree Jude is drawing directly on an Enochic tradition, and very likely on the text we now know as 1st Enoch. That matters. because Jude does not merely mention Enoch in passing. He introduces him as a prophet. For early Christian readers, this was not some obscure name from a forgotten shelf. Enoch was part of the intellectual world they lived in, a world filled with expectation, a world convinced that evil was real, that rebellious spiritual powers were active, and that God would not allow injustice to rule forever. The earliest Christians inherited these questions from Second Temple Judaism. Why is the world so broken? Where did evil come from? What are demons? Why do the wicked seem to prosper? When will God intervene? First Enoch offered a dramatic answer. The world was corrupt not only because humans sinned, but because heavenly beings had crossed a forbidden boundary. The Watchers descended, they taught destructive knowledge, their giant offspring filled the earth with violence. And God set a date for judgment. That framework resonated deeply with early Christian apocalyptic thought. Jude itself speaks of angels who did not keep their own position but abandoned their proper dwelling. God, Jude says, has kept them in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. That sounds very much like the Watchers. 2 Peter contains a similar warning. It speaks of angels who sinned, cast into gloomy darkness, and held for judgment. It places their punishment near the story of Noah and the flood. The New Testament does not stop and say, "Here is our official interpretation of First Enoch," but the echoes are hard to ignore. The language of imprisoned angels, the days of Noah, the final judgment, heavenly rebels awaiting punishment. The coming of the Lord with holy beings. These ideas were moving through the same ancient religious atmosphere, and the earliest Christians were breathing that air. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into ancient mysteries, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website. The link is in the description. But now we need to be careful because this is where people often jump too far. Jude, quoting Enoch, does not automatically mean that every early Christian believed First Enoch belonged in the Bible. Ancient authors quoted all kinds of sources. Paul quoted Greek poets. Biblical writers could use a familiar saying, a hymn, a historical record, or a respected work without declaring that every line of that source carried the same authority as the books of Scripture. Quotation proves awareness. It can show respect. It can show influence. But it does not, by itself, settle the question of canon. And canon was not decided all at once. There was no single meeting in the first century where every Christian leader opened a master list and stamped books in or out. Different churches used different collections of texts. Different regions preserved different traditions. And for centuries, Christians debated not only books like Enoch, but also books that are now in the New Testament. Hebrews was questioned in some places. Revelation was disputed in others. 2 Peter, James, Jude, and several other books had complicated paths toward broad acceptance. So the fact that First Enoch was known, quoted, and valued does not make its later exclusion a simple mystery with a simple villain. Still, some early Christian writers clearly found Enoch compelling. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around the end of the 2nd century, openly defended the book. He knew that some Christians rejected it because it was not included in the Jewish scriptures used in his day. But Tertullian argued that Jude's use of Enoch showed the book deserved respect. He even suggested that Noah might have preserved Enoch's writings through the flood, or that Enoch's message had been restored afterward. That is not historical proof. It is Tertullian trying to explain how an ancient prophecy could survive. But it tells us something important. For him, Enoch was not embarrassing. It was useful. It explained angels, demons, judgment, and the moral danger of a corrupt world. Clement of Alexandria also seems comfortable drawing on Enochic traditions. Origen knew the book and referred to it, though he also recognized that it was not accepted everywhere. Other writers used ideas that sound Enochic without necessarily treating the whole work as scripture. Then, over time, the landscape shifted. As Christian communities increasingly defined which writings would be read publicly in worship and used to establish doctrine, First Enoch became less secure in many regions. Greek and Latin-speaking churches gradually moved away from it. Some church fathers doubted its authorship. Others objected that it was not part of the Jewish canon they recognized. Others may simply have considered it valuable but secondary. By the time of Augustine, Enoch was generally not treated as canonical in the Latin West. But not canonical did not mean unknown. Its stories kept circulating. Its angelology kept echoing. Its interpretation of Genesis 6 kept shaping debates about the sons of God, fallen angels, giants, demons, and the flood. And that makes perfect sense. The earliest Christians lived under Roman power. Many were poor, many faced exclusion, mockery, or persecution. They looked at a world where violence could seem permanent and injustice could look unstoppable. A book like Enoch promised that heaven had seen it all. The rebellious angels would not escape, the violent would not rule forever. The secrets used to corrupt humanity would be exposed, and God would come with his holy ones to judge the earth. That was not just a strange angel story. For believers living in an uncertain world, it was a declaration that evil had an expiration date. And within Enoch, there was another figure who seemed to carry that hope even further. A mysterious heavenly judge, a chosen one, a figure called the Son of Man. That phrase, the Son of Man, may sound instantly familiar to Christian ears. In the Gospels, Jesus uses it again and again. The Son of Man has authority. The Son of Man must suffer. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. But first Enoch uses the language too. And that is where the story gets complicated. The section of first Enoch known as the Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes of Enoch, is one of the most debated parts of the entire collection. It appears in chapters 37 through 71. Unlike the stories of the Watchers and the Giants, this section is not mainly concerned with rebellious angels corrupting the earth. It is concerned with judgment, with the collapse of arrogant kings, with the vindication of the righteous, and with a mysterious figure who seems to stand beside God's throne, waiting for the moment when history will be set right. He is called the Chosen One, the Righteous One, the Anointed One, and most famously the Son of Man. This is not just a human prophet walking through the streets of ancient Israel. The figure in the Book of Parables is exalted, heavenly, and deeply mysterious. He is associated with God's final judgment. Kings and powerful people fear him. The wicked are exposed before him. The oppressed are defended. The righteous receive a future that violence and wealth could never buy. At one point, Enoch describes him as existing before the sun and stars were created. Before the world's foundations were laid, this chosen figure was already hidden in the presence of the Lord of Spirits. That is extraordinary language. It suggests more than a king who will one day be born, more than a military leader who defeats Israel's enemies. This is a figure whose role seems woven into the structure of the universe itself. Hidden from human eyes, preserved by God, then revealed at the appointed time to judge the earth. And if that sounds familiar, it should. The closest biblical parallel is probably Daniel chapter 7. Daniel sees a vision of beasts rising from the sea, representing brutal earthly kingdoms. Then the Ancient of Days takes his seat in judgment, and one like a son of man comes with the clouds of heaven and receives dominion, glory, and an everlasting kingdom. For centuries, readers have asked what Daniel meant. Was this human-like figure a symbol for the faithful people of Israel? Was he an angelic representative? Was he an individual Messiah? Or did the image leave room for several layers of meaning at once? The Book of Parables seems to take Daniel's strange image and push it further. The one like a son of man becomes a more distinct individual, a chosen heavenly judge, a figure who defeats the proud, judges rulers, protects the righteous, and reveals what has been hidden. This is why the Book of Parables matters so much. It gives us a window into the religious imagination of the Second Temple period, the centuries before and around the rise of Christianity. Judaism at that time was not one single set of expectations repeated by everyone everywhere. Different groups had different ideas about angels, resurrection, law, judgment, the Messiah, and the end of the age. But many Jews shared a sense that the world was profoundly out of order. Foreign empires ruled the land. The righteous suffered. The corrupt seemed untouchable. God's promises appeared delayed. So people searched the scriptures and ancient traditions for signs that judgment was coming. They imagined God sending a king, a priest, a prophet, an angelic deliverer, or a heavenly Son of Man to break the power of evil. Then Christianity emerged inside that world, and the first Christians began making an astonishing claim. Jesus of Nazareth was not merely a teacher, healer, or martyr. He was the Messiah. He would return as judge. He had authority from heaven. He would come in glory. He was, in a sense that became central to Christian belief, the Son of Man. That does not mean the Book of Parables is simply a Christian text hiding inside 1st Enoch. Some earlier scholars argued exactly that. They saw the similarities with Christian language and concluded that the Book of Parables must have been written after Jesus by a Christian author or heavily edited by Christians. It is easy to see why they thought so. A pre-existent chosen figure. Final judgment, the humiliation of kings, the salvation of the righteous. The title, Son of Man. These ideas sit uncomfortably close to language Christians later used about Jesus. But the case is not that simple. The Book of Parables never names Jesus. It does not mention the crucifixion. It does not describe resurrection in the specifically Christian sense. It does not tell the story of the church, the apostles, or the gospel. And its Son of Man does not neatly match every later Christian claim. The similarities are real, but similarity is not identity. Most scholars today think the section probably comes from a Jewish setting, though they continue to debate exactly when it was written. Some place it in the late 1st century before Christ. Others date it closer to the 1st century after Christ. A few still see possible Christian influence, especially because no surviving fragments of the Book of Parables were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That absence is important, but it is not decisive. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve parts of several Enochic books, proving that Enochic traditions circulated widely before Christianity. But the caves do not preserve every text that existed. A missing manuscript can mean a work was written later. It can also mean it simply was not copied, stored, or preserved at Qumran. Ancient evidence is often like that, not a complete library. More like a handful of burned pages rescued from a vast lost archive. So the debate continues. Was the Book of Parables written before Jesus, showing that ideas about a heavenly Son of Man were already circulating in Jewish apocalyptic thought? Was it written after Jesus, but still by a Jewish author, working in a world where Christian claims had become impossible to ignore? Or does it preserve older traditions while also reflecting later developments? There is no universal answer, but whichever date one prefers, the Book of Parables changes the conversation. It shows that the phrase Son of Man did not emerge in a vacuum. It belonged to a much larger world of visions, judgment, angels, suffering, and hope. A world where people believed heaven had a hidden answer to earthly injustice. And there is one final twist. Near the end of the Book of Parables, Enoch himself becomes strangely connected with this heavenly Son of Man figure. The language is difficult, and scholars disagree over exactly what is happening. Is Enoch being identified with the Son of Man? Is he receiving a new heavenly role? Is the text preserving two traditions that have been woven together? Whatever the answer, the scene is deliberately unsettling. The human who walked with God does not simply disappear into heaven. He becomes part of heaven's courtroom, part of its hidden knowledge, part of its coming judgment. That is the power of Enoch's vision. The universe is not silent. Earthly rulers may look invincible. Violence may seem permanent, but above the chaos, the heavenly books are open, the angels are watching, and the chosen judge is waiting. And Enoch's next revelation turns from the fate of kings and sinners to something even stranger. The ordered movement of the sun, the moon, the stars, and a calendar that claim to measure time itself. The Book of Enoch does not stop at heavenly judges, hidden books, and the fate of kings. It goes higher, past the clouds, past the stars, into a universe where time itself is regulated by angels, where the sun enters through numbered gates in the sky, where the moon follows a measured path, and where every season arrives exactly when heaven commands it. This section is often called the Astronomical Book, or the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. It appears in 1st Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, and parts of it may be among the oldest material in the entire Enochic collection. At first it can feel strange, almost technical. Enoch is shown the movements of the sun, the phases of the moon, the rising and setting of stars, the changing length of days, the divisions of the year. There are gates in the east and gates in the west, 6 gates for the sun's yearly journey. Angelic guides explain how light enters the world, how darkness increases, and how the seasons turn. But this is not ancient people doing astronomy in the modern scientific sense. It is not a telescope-based model of the solar system. It does not describe planets orbiting the sun, gravity, galaxies, or the actual mechanics of the universe as modern science understands them. It is something different. It is sacred cosmology. A map of reality designed to make one overwhelming point. Heaven is ordered. Nothing in the skies moves by accident. The sun does not rise because of chaos. The moon does not wander without purpose. The stars do not appear randomly like sparks thrown across a black sky. Every light in heaven has a course. Every course has a boundary. Every boundary has an angel assigned to guard it. In Enoch's vision, the universe is more like a vast kingdom than an empty machine. There are laws, there are schedules, there are gates. There are officials, and above all of them stands God, the source of the order holding everything together. The calendar at the centre of this vision had 364 days. That number may sound arbitrary, but it was elegant. 364 divides neatly into 4 seasons of 91 days each. Each season could be arranged into 13 weeks. Festivals could fall on the same day of the week every year. Sacred time would be stable, predictable, impossible to confuse. Think about what that means in a religious world where feast days mattered enormously. If Passover was supposed to happen at a specific time, you needed to know when that time was. If priests were serving in the temple according to rotating schedules, the calendar determined who served and when. If harvest festivals, fasts, Sabbaths, and sacrifices were commanded by God, then getting the dates wrong was not a minor scheduling problem. It was a theological crisis, because which calendar you followed could determine whether you believed you were worshipping on God's appointed day or on a day chosen by human error, and ancient Jewish groups did not all agree. The calendar used in much of later Jewish tradition was lunar-solar. Months followed the moon, while adjustments had to be made to keep festivals aligned with the agricultural year. It worked, but it required observation, judgment, and occasional correction. The Enochic calendar offered something cleaner, a fixed solar year, 364 days, 4 perfectly ordered seasons, no uncertainty about when a festival should occur, no dependence on a priestly authority looking at the new moon and declaring that a new month had begun. For communities that distrusted the Jerusalem priesthood, this mattered deeply. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have found calendars that use a 364-day year, along with priestly schedules carefully organized around it. The community at Qumran may not have created this system, but they clearly valued a vision of sacred time that looked very much like the world described in Enoch. Their message was explosive, even if it was expressed through dates and calculations. The temple establishment may claim to control worship. But what if they are keeping the wrong calendar? What if the official festivals are being observed on the wrong days? What if the priests in Jerusalem are out of sync, not just with a mathematical system, but with heaven itself? That is why arguments about calendars could become arguments about legitimacy, purity, and power. Because time was not neutral, time belonged to God. And in 1st Enoch, God's time is visible above everyone's head. Every sunrise is evidence, every changing season is testimony. Every star keeping its appointed course is a silent rebuke to a human world that has forgotten its own boundaries. This is where the astronomical book connects back to the Watchers. The Watchers crossed a boundary. They abandoned their proper dwelling. They descended to earth. They took human women. They taught forbidden arts. They unleashed violence, greed, weapons, sorcery, and corruption into a world that had once been ordered. Their sin was not merely that they broke a rule, they violated the structure of creation. They tried to take what was not theirs to take, and the result was disorder everywhere. The giants consume the earth. Human beings destroy one another. Knowledge meant for heaven becomes a tool of exploitation. The natural balance collapses under the weight of violence. Now compare that chaos with Enoch's heavens. The sun does not abandon its gate. The moon does not seize the sun's path. The stars do not decide they are above the laws that govern them. They keep their stations, they follow their courses. They obey. The contrast is almost painfully clear. Creation itself is faithful. The lights of heaven do what they were appointed to do. But angels and humans, beings with will and desire, are capable of rebellion. And that rebellion creates suffering. There is also a warning hidden inside the calendar. The Astronomical book says that sinners will alter the order of time. They will become confused about the months, the seasons, and the appointed days. Whether this refers to a specific rival calendar, corrupt religious leaders, or a broader human failure to recognize divine order, the meaning is clear. To lose the calendar is to lose your place in the cosmos. You no longer know when the holy days arrive. You no longer recognize the rhythm built into creation. You drift away from the pattern heaven has established. For modern readers, the details can seem alien. 6 gates of the sun, angels governing stars, a year with 364 days, even though the actual solar year is slightly longer. These are not scientific claims we are required to accept or reject as if 1st Enoch were a modern astronomy textbook. They are ancient visions expressed through the best cosmic language available to their writers. But the deeper question still lands. Is the universe ordered? And if it is, why does human life so often feel like chaos? Enoch's answer is not that chaos is normal. It is that chaos is rebellion. Disorder is what happens when creatures reject the limits that give life meaning. Heaven continues its appointed course, but earth has been wounded by beings who refuse to remain in theirs. And that is why the calendar was never just about counting days. It was about choosing which world you believed you lived in. A world ruled by human authorities, shifting traditions and political convenience. Or a world governed by a higher order, written in the movements of the heavens themselves. But if Enoch's calendar carried such powerful implications, it raises the next question. Why would a book filled with angels, cosmic secrets, disputed sacred time, and dangerous challenges to religious authority eventually be left outside most Bibles? The answer is more complicated than a secret meeting where powerful leaders gathered in a locked room, looked at the Book of Enoch, and said, "This one is too dangerous. Destroy it." That story is dramatic. It is also almost certainly too simple. There was no single moment when one authority removed First Enoch from every Bible. No universal decree, no ancient committee with the power to erase a book that had already been copied, translated, quoted, debated, and read across centuries of Jewish and Christian history. What happened was slower than that, messier than that, and in some ways more interesting. Biblical canons did not drop from heaven as finished tables of contents. They developed gradually. Different Jewish communities preserved different texts. Different Christian churches read different collections of books. A writing could be deeply respected in one place, used in worship in another, and viewed with caution somewhere else. For centuries, the boundaries were not always fixed. Think of it less like one library with one official catalogue, and more like a vast network of communities spread across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Each community had scrolls, each had traditions, each had teachers deciding which writings carried the greatest authority. First Enoch moved through that world. We know it circulated in ancient Judaism because fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not one tiny scrap. Multiple manuscripts, portions of the Book of Watchers, the Astronomical book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch all appear at Qumran. That means the book was not some late medieval invention. It was being copied and studied centuries before Christianity. But circulation is not the same thing as canon. A text could be influential without becoming scripture for everyone. It could shape how people imagined angels, demons, judgment, giants, heaven, evil, and the end of history, while still remaining outside the collection eventually recognized as the Hebrew Bible. So why did that happen? Part of the answer involves language. First Enoch was originally composed in Aramaic, with perhaps some material shaped in Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve Aramaic fragments, proving that the book belonged to the Jewish world of the Second Temple period. Later it was translated into Greek. Eventually, the complete text survived in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. But as centuries passed, complete copies disappeared from Jewish and most Christian communities. The book became harder to access, harder to copy, harder to compare. And a text that is not widely available has a much harder time maintaining authority. Another issue was date and authorship. The book claims to preserve revelations given by Enoch, the mysterious figure who walked with God before the flood. But most scholars believe First Enoch was not written by the biblical Enoch himself. It is a collection of works composed over several centuries, probably between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. That does not mean ancient readers thought it was worthless. Ancient religious literature often spoke through the voice of a revered figure from the past. This is called pseudepigraphy. It was a way of placing a message within an ancient sacred tradition. But as Jewish and Christian communities debated which books belonged in their scriptures, questions became sharper. Was this text truly ancient? Was it connected to a recognized prophet? Was it written in the sacred language? Was it consistent with the Torah and the prophets? Was it read broadly across the community? Did respected teachers use it in worship and interpretation? First Enoch received different answers in different places. In Jewish rabbinic tradition, the book was not preserved as scripture. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Jewish religious life changed dramatically. The temple was gone. Priestly politics, sectarian disputes, and apocalyptic movements had left deep scars. Rabbinic teachers increasingly centered Jewish identity on the Torah, the prophets, the writings, legal interpretation, and traditions that could sustain a people living without the temple. First Enoch came from a different religious atmosphere. It was intensely apocalyptic. It expanded the story of Genesis. It gave enormous attention to rebellious angels, cosmic journeys, heavenly secrets, and coming judgment. It also carried ideas connected with disputed calendars and priestly controversies that may have mattered deeply to groups like those at Qumran. For later rabbinic Judaism, that was not necessarily the foundation they wanted to build on. The book did not vanish from memory overnight. Its ideas continued to echo. The story of fallen angels remained known. Enoch himself remained in Genesis. Ancient traditions about heavenly journeys and dangerous knowledge continued to circulate. But First Enoch was not included among the books that Rabbinic Judaism came to treat as scripture. Christian communities faced a similar process, but with different results. Some early Christians knew Enoch well. The letter of Jude even quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch. Early writers such as Tertullian defended the book's value, partly because Jude appeared to use it. Other Christian thinkers knew it, borrowed its imagery, or treated it with respect. But respect was not the same as universal acceptance. As Christian churches began defining their own collections of authoritative writings, First Enoch faced problems. It was not included in the Jewish scriptural collection that many Christians looked to as the Old Testament. Its authorship was disputed. Its complex angelology could seem strange or excessive. And its full text became increasingly unavailable in Greek and Latin-speaking churches. Over time, most Christian traditions left it outside their biblical canon. Most, not all. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved First Enoch as scripture. While much of the Christian world lost the complete book, Ethiopia kept it alive. Monks copied it. Scholars read it. Believers treated it not as a forbidden secret, but as part of their biblical inheritance. That fact alone changes the story. Enoch was not erased. It was preserved by one of the world's oldest Christian traditions. So exclusion from most Bibles does not mean the book was unknown. It does not mean it was irrelevant, and it definitely does not mean nobody wanted people to read it. It means ancient communities made different judgments about authority. Some saw Enoch as sacred scripture. Others saw it as valuable but uncertain. Others saw it as fascinating, influential, even dangerous, but not a book to place beside Genesis, Isaiah, or the Gospels. And that leaves us with another question. If no single authority secretly banned Enoch, why do so many people still believe church leaders suppressed it? Because it revealed truths they wanted hidden. Because the suppression story has a powerful villain. It gives us a clear explanation for a complicated historical mystery. A book describes angels descending from heaven, taking human wives, producing giants, teaching forbidden knowledge, revealing the structure of the cosmos, and predicting divine judgment. Then later church leaders decide the book is too explosive, too embarrassing, too revealing, so they hide it. It sounds like the plot of a lost conspiracy thriller. And there is one part of it that is true. Institutions have always shaped which texts survive. Scribes decide what gets copied. Bishops decide what gets read publicly. Teachers decide what belongs in a school. Monasteries decide which manuscripts are worth preserving when parchment is expensive, and every copy takes months, sometimes years of labour. Power affects transmission. It affects memory. It affects which voices remain loud and which become faint. But that is very different from proving a coordinated campaign to conceal dangerous secrets. The evidence we have points to debates, disagreements, changing languages, lost manuscripts, and evolving standards of authority. It does not point to a single church-wide operation that hunted down every copy of Enoch, because it contained information too dangerous for ordinary believers. Think about what such a campaign would have required. First Enoch had already circulated in multiple languages across enormous distances. Aramaic-speaking Jewish communities knew it. Greek-speaking readers knew versions of it. Early Christians in North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and elsewhere encountered its ideas. The letter of Jude quoted it. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved portions of it, and complete copies survived in Ethiopia. To erase a book like that, somebody would have needed control over communities that did not answer to one bishop, one emperor, one city, or even one language. That is not how the ancient religious world worked. Christianity itself was divided by geography, theology, politics, and language. Greek churches, Latin churches, Syriac churches, Coptic churches, Armenian churches, Ethiopian churches. They did not always agree on major doctrines, much less on every disputed book. Even the biblical canon developed differently in different traditions. So the idea of one hidden decision changing every Bible everywhere does not fit the evidence. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. There were real reasons some leaders felt uneasy about Enoch. The book takes a brief and mysterious passage in Genesis, the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and turns it into a massive cosmic rebellion. The Watchers are not vague heavenly beings. They are named. They descend on Mount Hermon. They take human women. They teach warfare, enchantments, astrology, metalworking, cosmetics, and the reading of signs in the sky. Their giant children devastate the earth. Their spirits become demons after death. That is an enormous theological system built around a few verses in Genesis. For communities trying to establish clear teachings about God, angels, human sin, demons, marriage, judgment, and salvation, Enoch could raise difficult questions. Can angels truly have bodies? Can they desire human beings? Can they reproduce? If evil entered the world partly through angelic rebellion, what does that mean for human responsibility? Are demons fallen angels or the spirits of dead giants? Is secret heavenly knowledge a gift from God, a danger to humanity, or both? Different Jewish and Christian thinkers answered those questions differently. Some embraced Enoch's framework. Others preferred interpretations that made the sons of God human rulers, descendants of Seth, or powerful men rather than angels. That reading avoided the unsettling image of heavenly beings crossing the boundary between heaven and earth. And Enoch's world was not just crowded with angels. It was crowded with layers of heaven, cosmic prisons, storehouses of wind and snow, portals of the sun and moon, heavenly tablets, angelic guides, secret calendars, and visions of judgment. It gave readers a universe that felt vast, ordered, dangerous, and full of hidden forces. For some believers that was thrilling, for others it was too elaborate, too speculative, too easily connected with astrology, magical practice, or claims that private revelation outranked public teaching. And that matters. When religious institutions become established, they often become cautious about texts that can be used to support endless new revelations. A book like Enoch could inspire devotion, but it could also inspire people to claim they possessed secret knowledge about angels, calendars, the end of the world, or the hidden architecture of heaven. Church leaders did not need to believe Enoch revealed literal forbidden technology, ancient aliens, or a secret history of the human race in order to be wary of it. The book was already challenging enough on its own terms. But caution is not the same as suppression. A text can fall out of use through something far less dramatic than a ban. Language disappears. A community stops speaking Aramaic, then stops reading Greek, then relies on Latin translations that do not include the book. A manuscript wears out. A library burns. A monastery has limited resources and copies the books used in worship first. A generation inherits only fragments, quotations, and rumours of a text that earlier generations could read in full. Over time, absence creates its own momentum. If few copies survive, fewer teachers know the book. If fewer teachers know it, fewer scribes copy it. If it is not copied, it becomes even rarer. Eventually, people may assume it was always marginal, simply because they no longer have access to it. That is probably closer to what happened across much of the Mediterranean world. Enoch did not need to be locked away in a secret vault. It only needed to become less available than Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, Matthew, or Paul. Once that happened, its authority weakened naturally. Still, we should not pretend institutions were neutral. They made choices. Those choices favoured certain books, certain languages, certain theological boundaries, and certain kinds of authority. The books inside the canon gained the power of public reading, commentary, liturgy, copying, and education. Books outside it could remain influential, but they stood at the edge of the library rather than at its centre. That shaped history. It shaped what millions of believers heard as scripture. It shaped how Genesis was interpreted. It shaped whether the Watchers were remembered as central characters in the origin of evil, or as a strange ancient tradition left outside the biblical frame. So no, there is no solid evidence that church leaders suppressed Enoch because it exposed a forbidden secret they desperately needed to hide. But yes, religious authority helped determine which ancient secrets remained familiar and which became mysterious. And nowhere is that more clear than in the place where the complete Book of Enoch never disappeared at all. And that place was Ethiopia. While first Enoch gradually became rare in Greek and Latin Christian worlds, it remained alive in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Not as a strange forbidden manuscript hidden in a monastery basement. Not as a rumour preserved in quotations as a sacred book, copied by scribes, read within a living religious tradition, and included in a biblical canon broader than the one familiar to most Catholics and Protestants today. This is the reason we can still read 1st Enoch as a complete work. The oldest surviving complete manuscripts are written in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of Ethiopia. Ge'ez is no longer the everyday spoken language of most Ethiopians, much like Latin is not the everyday language of Rome. But for centuries it remained the language of Ethiopian worship, scholarship, scripture, and manuscript copying. And somewhere along the long route between ancient Jewish Aramaic, Greek translation, and Ethiopian Christianity, 1st Enoch crossed into that world. Then it stayed. Think about how extraordinary that is. Across much of the Mediterranean, Enoch became a book people remembered only in pieces, a line quoted by Jude, a reference from an early Christian writer, a disputed title on an old list. Scholars knew it had existed, but for centuries they did not have the whole thing. The Watchers, the Giants, the heavenly journeys, the cosmic calendar, the final judgment. Much of that world had vanished from European libraries, but in Ethiopia scribes kept making copies. Every manuscript was an act of survival. Before printing presses, a book did not survive because someone vaguely approved of it. It survived because a trained scribe sat down with parchment, ink, and time. Because a monastery valued it enough to preserve an older copy. Because someone corrected mistakes, repaired damaged pages, and taught the next generation to read the language. A manuscript could take months or years to produce. It was expensive, fragile, vulnerable to fire, water, war, insects, and simple neglect. So when a book remains in circulation for more than 1,000 years, That is not an accident. It means a community carried it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has one of the broadest biblical traditions in Christianity. The exact boundaries of its canon have been described in different ways, and lists do not always line up perfectly with modern Western categories. But the central fact is clear. Ethiopia preserved books that most other Christian traditions eventually placed outside their Bibles. First Enoch was one of them. Another was Jubilees, a Jewish work that retells Genesis and Exodus through a different theological lens. These texts were not treated in Ethiopia as embarrassing leftovers from an abandoned age. They became part of a scriptural inheritance, woven into a Christian tradition with its own ancient history, liturgy, languages, saints, and scholars. And for a long time, Europe barely understood what it had lost. Then, in the 18th century, Ethiopian manuscripts began reaching European collections. The most famous figure in this story was the Scottish traveller James Bruce. After travelling through Ethiopia, Bruce returned to Europe in 1773 with Guiers manuscripts of First Enoch. He believed he had recovered a book that Western scholars had known about from ancient references, but had not possessed in complete form for centuries. Suddenly, the lost book was no longer completely lost. At first, scholars had to work through a difficult problem. The text was in Ge'ez, a language few Europeans could read. Early translations were slow, imperfect, and sometimes based on limited manuscript evidence. But the discovery caused an intellectual shockwave. Here was a full-scale ancient work describing fallen angels, giant offspring, journeys through heaven, cosmic secrets, and a coming judge called the Son of Man. It was not a modern invention, it was not a medieval fantasy. But one enormous question remained. How ancient was the Ethiopian text itself? Could it really preserve a Jewish book from the centuries before Christianity? Or had it been heavily reshaped over time, perhaps even created much later than people thought? Then the desert answered. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls found near Qumran were fragments of First Enoch written in Aramaic. Not Ge'ez, not medieval Ethiopian script. Aramaic, the language of many Jewish communities in the Second Temple period. The fragments are incomplete, often only small pieces of larger sections, but they include parts of the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch, and they change the entire conversation. The Ethiopian manuscripts were not simply preserving a late Christian legend. Behind them stood a genuinely ancient Jewish composition, or more accurately, a collection of ancient compositions assembled under Enoch's name. The Qumran fragments showed that major parts of the book were circulating in Aramaic long before the medieval Ethiopian manuscripts we possess. That does not mean every surviving Ge'ez line is identical to the earliest version. Manuscripts change. Translators make choices. Scribes occasionally omit, add, harmonize, or misunderstand words. First Enoch itself has a long and complicated textual history. But the basic structure survived. The Watchers survived. The giants survived. The heavenly journeys survived. The strange solar calendar survived. The visions of judgment survived. And they survived in full, because Ethiopia did what much of the rest of the Christian world did not. It kept copying the book. So Ethiopia was not a footnote in the Enoch story. It was the bridge across the abyss. Without Ethiopian scribes, Ethiopian monasteries, Ethiopian scholars, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, First Enoch might have survived only as scattered Aramaic scraps in a desert cave and a few quotations in ancient authors. We would know it existed, but we might never have known its full voice. And that full voice brings us back to one of the smallest, strangest, and most contested passages in the entire Bible. Genesis chapter 6. Just a few verses before the flood, the story suddenly says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, took wives for themselves, and produced the Nephilim, the mysterious figures later remembered as mighty men, warriors, and men of renown. Then the flood comes. For such a short passage, it opens an enormous door. Who were these sons of God? Were they angels? Human kings? A righteous family line, and what exactly did their actions have to do with giants, demons, corruption, and the destruction of the world? Genesis itself does not stop to explain, it just moves on. And that silence created a debate that has lasted for more than 2,000 years. One interpretation says the sons of God were angelic beings. This is the reading that First Enoch takes and expands into an entire cosmic disaster. In Enoch, the Watchers are heavenly beings assigned to observe humanity. They descend on Mount Hermon, swear an oath together, take human women, and father the giants. The result is not an ordinary human crime. It is a violation of the boundaries of creation itself, heaven crossing into earth, spirit mixing with flesh. Knowledge meant for the heavenly realm being handed to humanity, before humanity is ready for it. Under this interpretation, Genesis 6 is not a strange little interruption before Noah's Ark. It is the beginning of the catastrophe. Human wickedness is real, but it is intensified by a rebellion that began above the human world. And First Enoch leaves very little doubt about how its authors understood the sons of God. They were angels, more specifically they were watchers. The name watchers is not used in Genesis 6 itself, but it appears in later biblical and Jewish traditions, especially in the Book of Daniel, where heavenly beings are called watchers. Enoch takes that idea and gives it a story. These beings were supposed to watch. Instead, they desired. They descended. They taught forbidden arts. And they created a generation of giants whose violence overwhelmed the earth. For ancient Jewish readers familiar with Enochic tradition, Genesis 6 may have sounded far less mysterious than it sounds to many readers today. They may have heard sons of God and immediately thought of members of the heavenly court. That was not a bizarre idea in the ancient world. In several biblical passages, phrases like sons of God or sons of the Most High can refer to heavenly beings. The opening of the book of Job describes the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. Psalm 82 speaks in the language of a divine council. Ancient Israelite religion, like the wider world around it, imagined God as supreme over a heavenly assembly of spiritual beings. So when Genesis says sons of God, some early interpreters believed the most natural reading was exactly what Enoch says it was, angels. But that was never the only interpretation. Another major reading says the sons of God were human rulers or kings. In the ancient Near East, kings sometimes claimed divine status, divine ancestry, or special closeness to the gods. Under this view, Genesis is condemning tyrannical rulers who took women whenever they wanted, building violent royal dynasties and calling themselves godlike. The Nephilim, then, might not be supernatural hybrids at all. They might be famous warriors, powerful clans, or feared men whose reputation became larger than life. There is also the Sethite interpretation, which became especially influential in later Jewish and Christian thought. In this reading, the sons of God are the descendants of Seth, the supposedly faithful line descending from Adam's son Seth. The daughters of men are the descendants of Cain, associated with the line of violence that began when Cain killed Abel. The problem, according to this interpretation, was not angels marrying women. It was righteous people marrying into a corrupt society and abandoning their faithfulness to God. That reading has an obvious theological advantage. It avoids the difficult question of how spiritual beings could produce children with human women. Jesus says in the Gospels that angels in heaven do not marry, and later interpreters often took that as a reason to reject the angelic reading altogether. But supporters of the angelic interpretation answer that Genesis 6 is specifically about angels who left their proper place. They were not acting as angels in heaven. They were rebels violating an order they were never meant to cross. And that is exactly how 1st Enoch frames it. The Watchers do not simply fall because they are attracted to human women. They abandon heaven. They reject their assigned boundaries. They bring corruption into the human world. Their children become giants. And after those giants die, Enoch says their disembodied spirits remain on earth as evil spirits. This is why the debate matters so much. If the sons of God were angels, then the Nephilim become something more than unusually large humans or legendary warriors. They become the offspring of a forbidden union between heaven and earth. And in Enoch's worldview, the origin of demons is connected to their death. The giants die in the flood, but their spirits remain, wandering, afflicting, deceiving, and attacking humanity. That is a very different explanation for evil than the one found in Genesis alone. Genesis emphasizes human violence. The earth is corrupt. Humanity has filled it with bloodshed. God sees the wickedness of human hearts and decides that judgment is coming. Enoch agrees that humanity is corrupt, but it asks a further question. Where did so much corruption come from? Its answer is that human beings were not alone in causing it. Heavenly rebels gave them weapons, magic, warfare, cosmetics, metalworking, astrology, enchantments, and knowledge that turned desire into domination. The flood in that framework is not only a judgment on human sin, it is an act of cosmic cleansing after creation itself has been invaded. That is why later readers became cautious. Accept Enoch's interpretation, and Genesis 6 becomes a story about fallen angels, hybrid giants, wandering demon spirits, and a supernatural rebellion behind the violence of the ancient world. Reject it, and the passage becomes a warning about human arrogance, corrupt rulers, or the collapse of a faithful family line. Both approaches are trying to make sense of the same few verses, and neither can claim that Genesis spells out every answer. 1st Enoch does not settle the question for everyone. It is an interpretation, though an ancient and influential one. But it proves something crucial. Long before medieval legends, long before modern theories about aliens or secret civilizations, ancient Jewish writers were already reading Genesis 6 as the trace of an angelic catastrophe. For them, the flood was not just rain, it was the response to a world where the boundary between heaven and earth had been broken. And once you see the flood as a response to a broken boundary between heaven and earth, the giants stop being a strange side detail. They become the centre of the disaster. But here is where the story gets even more interesting. Enoch's giants did not appear in a vacuum. Across the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, people told stories about enormous beings, ancient warrior races, divine offspring, and a lost age before the world became what it is now. The details change from culture to culture, but the pattern keeps returning. In Mesopotamia, the world of ancient Babylon and Assyria, there were stories of semi-divine sages called the Apkallu. These beings were associated with knowledge from before the flood, knowledge that could bless humanity but also become dangerous when mishandled. The famous epic of Gilgamesh tells of a hero who is not fully ordinary, described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Gilgamesh is not a Nephilim. The stories are not identical. But they emerge from a world where the line between gods, heroes, and humans was often imagined as dangerously thin. In ancient Greek mythology there were titans, cyclopes, and giants. The Gigantomachy, the war between the gods and the giants, became one of the great mythic battles of Greek culture. The giants were often portrayed as powerful children of earth, enemies of divine order, beings whose rebellion threatened the structure of the cosmos itself. That should sound familiar. In Enoch, the giants are not just big people. They are the visible evidence that cosmic order has been violated. They consume the resources of the earth. Then they consume humanity. Then, when human beings can no longer sustain them, they turn on one another. Violence spreads outward until the whole creation is drowning in it. Different cultures gave different answers to the same ancient fear. What happens when power becomes too great? What happens when beings meant to remain separate cross forbidden boundaries? What happens when the old world is ruled by warriors so strong that ordinary people cannot resist them? The Bible has its own giant traditions too. Genesis mentions the Nephilim. Numbers speaks of the Anakim, a people so formidable that Israelite scouts claim they felt like grasshoppers beside them. Deuteronomy remembers Og, king of Bashan, and describes his enormous bed. Later traditions speak of the Rephaim, shadowy ancient figures associated with dead warriors, giant clans, and lands east of the Jordan. But we have to be careful here. Ancient texts often use size the way modern people use legends. A powerful enemy becomes larger in memory. A feared king becomes almost superhuman. A ruined fortress becomes the work of giants because nobody can imagine ordinary people moving stones that large. The language may preserve a memory of real warrior groups, unusual individuals, or ancient populations remembered as formidable. Or it may be mythic language from the beginning, possibly both. And that uncertainty is exactly where modern speculation rushes in. Every few years a photograph appears online. It shows an enormous skeleton being excavated from the ground, surrounded by tiny human workers. The caption claims it is proof that archaeologists uncovered a Nephilim, an ancient giant, or the remains of a forgotten race that museums are hiding from the public. The image spreads fast. It gets reposted thousands of times. Someone adds a Bible verse. Someone else claims the Smithsonian confiscated the bones. Soon the story has everything needed to go viral. Ancient mystery, secret institutions, forbidden evidence, and a giant buried beneath the earth. But almost every famous image of this kind falls apart under inspection. Many were digitally altered as part of old internet art contests. Others come from movie props, manipulated photographs, or completely unrelated excavations. The scale is wrong, the source cannot be traced. The article leads back to a satirical website, an anonymous social media account, or a chain of reposts where nobody knows who made the original claim. And real archaeology does not work like that. A genuine discovery of a human skeleton 10 or 20 feet tall would not be quietly erased. It would transform anatomy, human evolution, archaeology, and genetics overnight. It would be studied by researchers around the world. There would be excavation reports, bone measurements, laboratory tests, museum records, peer-reviewed analysis, and multiple independent teams examining the evidence. There is no verified archaeological evidence for a population of human-like giants matching the scale imagined in popular Nephilim stories. That does not mean ancient giant traditions are meaningless. It means we should not confuse ancient texts with modern headlines, or faith with fabricated photographs. For religious readers, the giants can carry theological meaning whether or not they are understood as literal biological hybrids. They represent violence without limits, appetite without restraint, strength detached from justice. In Enoch, they are what happens when heavenly rebellion and human corruption feed each other until the world itself becomes unlivable. That message does not become smaller because a viral skeleton photo is fake. If anything, it becomes clearer. Ancient people were trying to explain why the world could feel dominated by forces larger than ordinary human control. Armies, kings, famine, war, bloodlines, forbidden knowledge. The terrifying feeling that violence, once unleashed, develops a life of its own. They gave those forces enormous bodies. They called them giants. And we still do something similar today. Look at modern culture. Giants are everywhere. In fantasy stories, they are ancient powers sleeping beneath mountains. In superhero films, they are mutations, monsters, experiments, gods, and invaders. In conspiracy theories, they are proof that history has been hidden from us. In video games, the giant is often the ultimate enemy, too large to defeat by strength alone, requiring courage, intelligence, and sacrifice. Why do these stories keep working? Because giants make invisible fears visible. A giant can be a tyrant, a war machine, a corrupt system, a disaster too large for one person to stop. It can also be the past itself, towering over us, full of ruins and unanswered questions. And Enoch adds one more disturbing possibility. Maybe the giant is not merely something ancient humanity encountered. Maybe it is something humanity helped create. That idea has never stopped being relevant, and once giants become connected to forbidden knowledge, heavenly descent, and a lost world before the flood, another modern theory almost inevitably appears. What if the Watchers were not angels at all? What if they were aliens? For millions of people, this is where the Book of Enoch stops being ancient religious literature and becomes something that feels almost like science fiction. Beings come down from the sky. They land on a mountain. They teach human beings advanced skills. They mate with women. Their offspring become giants. Enoch himself is taken through the heavens and shown structures, lights, chambers, and movements in the sky that sound strange to modern ears. Put those details into the language of the 21st century, and the theory almost writes itself. The Watchers become extraterrestrials. Mount Hermon becomes a landing site. Forbidden knowledge becomes alien technology. The giants become hybrids. And Enoch's journeys through heaven become descriptions of spacecraft, other planets, or encounters with beings from somewhere beyond Earth. This idea did not come from the ancient world itself. It is a modern reinterpretation, popularized especially in the 20th century, by writers who argued that ancient myths were misunderstood memories of contact with advanced visitors from space. Their basic question was simple and provocative. Could ancient people have seen technology they did not understand and described it using the only vocabulary they had? If you saw a machine fly across the sky before words like aircraft, engine, or spacecraft existed, maybe you would call it a fiery chariot. If you encountered visitors with knowledge beyond your own, maybe you would call them gods, angels, or watchers. It is an interesting thought experiment, and Enoch gives it plenty of material to work with. The Watchers descend from heaven. They are not vague spiritual forces. They make an agreement. They take human wives. They pass on specific kinds of knowledge. Azazel teaches the working of metals, including weapons and ornaments. Other Watchers teach spells, astrology, the signs of the clouds, the courses of the moon, and the movements of the stars. To a modern reader, that can sound less like religion and more like an ancient civilization receiving a sudden injection of advanced information. Then there are Enoch's heavenly journeys. He is carried upward. He sees brilliant lights, paths of stars, storehouses of wind and snow, gates through which heavenly bodies move, and a vast ordered cosmos governed by laws beyond ordinary human understanding. Some readers see ancient cosmology. Others see a report filtered through ancient language. But this is where we have to slow down, because a story involving the sky does not automatically become evidence of space travel. A being from heaven is not automatically a being from another planet. And knowledge that appears mysterious to us is not necessarily technological knowledge. The Book of Enoch was written in a world filled with religious imagery. Ancient Jewish writers imagined the universe as a layered cosmos. Earth was below, the heavens were above, God's throne was in the highest heaven. Angels moved between realms. The stars were not just distant balls of gas. They were part of an ordered creation, sometimes described almost like living servants obeying divine commands. That is not primitive science waiting to be translated into modern astronomy. It is a different way of seeing reality. When Enoch describes gates in heaven through which the sun, moon, winds and stars travel, he is not describing a launch facility. He is explaining the order of nature through the cosmology available to his time. When he sees blazing fire, crystal-like structures, terrifying beings and heavenly thrones, those images belong to the language of visions, temples, kingship, judgment, and divine majesty. Ancient religious texts are full of images that feel strange because they are meant to feel strange. They are trying to describe the boundary between the human world and the divine world, and that boundary is supposed to be overwhelming. Think about the problem Enoch's writers faced. How do you describe a reality no human being can control? How do you put the power of storms, stars, death, time, justice, and the unknown into words? You use fire. You use mountains. You use wings, thrones, clouds, shining metal, thunder, darkness, and doors in the sky. Those images are not necessarily coded technical diagrams. They are symbols powerful enough to carry an encounter with the unimaginable, and the text itself never calls the watchers visitors from another world. It does not say they came from a planet orbiting another star. It does not describe spacecraft, engines, alien civilizations, advanced machines, or technological devices hidden from humanity. It does not provide physical evidence, locations, artifacts, or a historical trail that could be independently tested. The Watchers are presented as angels. More specifically, they are heavenly beings who abandon their proper place in creation. Their crime is not merely that they arrive on Earth. Their crime is that they cross a boundary God established. They corrupt human beings, misuse knowledge, and produce chaos where there was supposed to be order. That is Enoch's concern, not extraterrestrial biology, not interstellar travel, not whether ancient humans reverse-engineered alien technology. Of course, there are still real questions worth asking. Why did stories of beings descending from heaven become so widespread across ancient cultures? Why were stars, mountains, and high places so often treated as meeting points between worlds? Why did knowledge of metalworking, weather, healing, warfare, and the calendar carry such spiritual weight? Those questions are open because they are questions about history, imagination, religion, and human experience. Maybe ancient people were responding to sudden changes in technology. A new weapon can feel like magic to someone who has never seen it. A skilled metalworker can seem to possess secret power. The ability to predict seasons, eclipses, or the motion of the moon can look like access to hidden heavenly knowledge. Maybe these stories preserve cultural memories of social upheaval when new elites, new tools and new forms of violence transformed entire communities. Or maybe they express something deeper, the fear that knowledge without wisdom does not save humanity. It makes humanity more dangerous. That is a mystery Enoch actually gives us. The ancient astronaut theory asks, did beings from space come down and change human history? Enoch asks something more disturbing. What happens when beings with power give knowledge to people who are not ready to use it? And what happens when the boundary between heaven and earth, power and responsibility, knowledge and morality, is broken? Whether someone reads the Watchers as literal angels, symbolic rebels, ancient myth, or something still unexplained, the text keeps pulling us back to that question. Why did ancient people imagine heavenly beings crossing into human history? Maybe because history has always felt invaded by forces larger than us. The sky above, the storm approaching, the stars moving in perfect order while human societies collapse into violence below. Enoch looks upward and sees watchers. Then it looks back at humanity and asks what we did with what came down, and that may be the real reason the Book of Enoch still matters. Not because it gives us a secret map to alien worlds, not because it proves giants walked the earth, not because every vision in its pages has to be read as literal history. It matters because it opens a window into the religious world that produced the Bible, shaped early Christianity, and influenced ideas that millions of people still carry today without realizing where they came from. To understand Enoch, you have to remember when it was written. The Book of Enoch is not one book composed by one man sitting down at one moment in history. It is a collection of writings developed over centuries, most likely between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, that places it in the period scholars call Second Temple Judaism, the turbulent age between the rebuilding of the Jerusalem Temple after the Babylonian exile and its destruction by Rome in 70 CE. This was a world under pressure. Jewish communities were living under foreign empires. First the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Old questions became urgent in new ways. Why do violent rulers prosper? Why do the righteous suffer? Why does evil seem organized, powerful, almost supernatural? If God is just, when will justice finally come? Enoch does not answer those questions quietly. It answers them with rebel angels, imprisoned watchers, monstrous giants, heavenly books, cosmic journeys, judgment fires, and a coming figure called the Son of Man. It takes the brief and mysterious passages of Genesis and expands them into an entire universe. In Genesis, the sons of God appear, take human women, and father the Nephilim. Then the flood comes. The story is only a few verses long. It is almost frustratingly brief. Enoch looks at that gap and says, no, this was not a small episode. This was a catastrophe that reached from heaven to earth. The Watchers did not simply fall. They brought corruption. They taught violence. They revealed forbidden arts. Their giant children consumed the world, and when the giants died, their spirits became the wandering evil forces later generations would call demons. Whether or not someone accepts that explanation as literal truth, it tells us something enormously important about ancient Jewish thought. By the time Enoch was circulating, many Jewish writers were trying to explain evil in more complex ways than simply saying humans make bad choices. Evil was personal. Evil was cosmic. Evil had a history. There were hostile powers beyond the visible world, but those powers were still under God's authority and moving toward judgment. That worldview becomes impossible to ignore when you read the New Testament. Suddenly, the world of early Christianity looks less unfamiliar. Jesus confronts demons. Satan is presented as an adversary. Fallen angels are linked to ancient rebellion. Final judgment is expected. The dead await resurrection. The righteous will be vindicated. The wicked will not escape forever, even if they seem untouchable now. Not every one of these ideas came directly from Enoch. Ancient Judaism was diverse, and many traditions contributed to the beliefs of the time. But Enoch shows us that these ideas were already alive, developing and being debated long before Christianity became a separate religion. It helps explain the mental landscape of the first Christians. And then there is the Son of Man, in parts of Enoch known as the Book of Parables. A heavenly figure appears as a chosen judge, associated with righteousness, glory, and the final defeat of kings and sinners. This figure is often called the Son of Man. Scholars continue to debate exactly when these passages were written, how they relate to other Jewish traditions, and whether they influence the language of the Gospels directly. But the parallel is striking. In the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly uses the phrase Son of Man. Sometimes it sounds humble, almost ordinary. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man came to serve, but other times the language becomes overwhelming. The Son of Man comes with clouds. He sits in judgment. He receives authority. He gathers the elect. That language does not appear out of nowhere. It belongs to a larger world of Jewish apocalyptic expectation, a world Enoch preserves in extraordinary detail, a world where heaven is watching history, where earthly power is temporary, and where justice may be delayed, but is never forgotten. Enoch also matters because it reveals how seriously ancient people took cosmic order. Its astronomical sections describe the movements of the sun, moon, stars, winds, seasons, and gates of heaven with almost obsessive precision. To a modern reader, some of that cosmology can feel strange. The universe is structured differently than the one mapped by telescopes and physics. But the point was not just astronomy. The point was order. The sun rises when it is supposed to rise. The moon follows its appointed course. The stars do not wander outside the paths assigned to them. Heaven obeys laws. Humanity, in Enoch's view, is the problem. The watchers abandon their proper place. The giants exceed every boundary. Human beings use knowledge for violence, vanity, and domination. Creation has an order, but rebellion is the decision to break it. That is why the book feels so intense. It is not merely fascinated by angels and monsters. It is asking whether the universe has a moral structure, whether power has limits, whether hidden knowledge can become destructive, whether the people causing suffering now will ever be held accountable. Those are not ancient questions. They are our questions. And Enoch's absence from most Bibles has not erased its influence. Far from it. The book survived in Ethiopia. Fragments were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its language appears in early Christian writings. The letter of Jude quotes it directly. Church fathers knew it, debated it, and sometimes valued it highly even when it did not become part of the biblical canon. That is the strange thing about canon. A canon can determine which books are read publicly as scripture. It can shape doctrine, worship, and authority for centuries. But it cannot completely erase a text that has already entered the imagination. Enoch continued to live in fragments, quotations, legends, art, theology, and popular fascination. It remained outside the boundaries for many communities, but never truly disappeared. And maybe that is what makes it so valuable. The Book of Enoch reminds us that ancient Judaism was not one single voice speaking in perfect agreement. It was a living, arguing, creative world. Different communities wrestled with angels, calendars, sacrifice, law, evil, resurrection, messiahs, and the end of history in different ways. Some of those voices became central. Others were pushed to the margins. But being pushed to the margins does not make a voice meaningless. It may make it more revealing, because sometimes the books left outside the official collection show us the questions that were too dangerous, too strange, too contested, or simply too complicated to settle. Enoch does not have to be canonized to be historically important. It does not have to be literal history to tell us what ancient people feared. And it does not have to be in every Bible to have helped shape the world behind the Bible. So maybe the final question is not, should the Book of Enoch have been included? Maybe the deeper question is this: when a text is excluded, does it lose its value? Or does it merely lose its official status, while continuing to whisper from the edges of history? That whisper is still there. It begins with one of the most unforgettable images in all ancient religious literature. Watchers descending from heaven onto Mount Hermon. Angels crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross. Human women drawn into a story that becomes bigger, darker, and more terrifying with every generation. Giants rising from that union, consuming the earth, spreading violence until the world itself seems poisoned. And then, standing in the middle of all this chaos, there is Enoch, the man who, in Genesis, appears for only a few lines. The man who walked with God and was no more, because God took him. In the Book of Enoch, that brief, mysterious figure becomes a traveller between worlds. He sees the places where rebel angels are imprisoned. He is shown the courses of the stars, the chambers of the winds, the books of heaven, the fate of the righteous, and the judgment waiting for kings, sinners, giants, and fallen powers. It is an enormous expansion of a tiny biblical mystery. And maybe that is why the book has never stopped pulling people toward it, because Enoch gives shape to questions that Genesis leaves open. Who were the sons of God? What were the Nephilim? Why was the world so corrupt before the flood? Where did demons come from? What happened to the angels who rebelled? What does divine judgment look like when evil becomes larger than any one human life? For ancient readers, these were not trivial questions. They were attempts to understand a world where violence was real, injustice was everywhere, and powerful people often seemed to escape consequences. But here is where we have to stay grounded. The most historically supported explanation for why one Enoch was excluded from most biblical canons is not that church leaders discovered a forbidden truth and tried to hide it from the world. It is more complicated than that, and honestly, more interesting. One Enoch was a respected and influential collection of Jewish writings. It circulated widely in the Second Temple period. It was known at Qumran, where Aramaic fragments were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was known to early Christians. Jude quotes a passage from it directly. Some early church writers valued it, others were cautious. Over time, however, most Jewish and Christian communities did not include it among their authoritative scriptures. Why? Partly because the canon was never formed by one simple vote. Different communities used different books, different languages mattered. Different traditions mattered. A text preserved in Hebrew or Aramaic used in worship and widely accepted across communities had a different path than a text surviving mainly through translation or associated with debates about angels, calendars, cosmic geography, and apocalyptic visions. By the time most Christian biblical canons became more settled, one Enoch had not achieved the same broad, continuous status as the books that became standard in Jewish scripture and most Christian Old Testaments. That does not mean it was unimportant. It means influence and canon are not the same thing. A book can shape the imagination of an age without being formally declared scripture. A book can be quoted, copied, argued over, feared, admired, and passed from community to community, while still remaining outside the final boundaries of a canon. That is exactly what happened with Enoch, and that distinction matters now more than ever, because Enoch attracts every kind of interpretation. Some people read it as ancient mythology. Some read it as inspired scripture. Some see a symbolic account of human corruption. Others see literal fallen angels and giants. Some connect its watchers to ancient astronaut theories, lost civilizations, or hidden technologies. But the evidence does not require those conclusions. The evidence tells us that ancient Jewish writers created and preserved powerful traditions about heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, giants, judgment, and the origin of evil. The evidence tells us that these traditions circulated before and during the rise of Christianity. The evidence tells us that one Enoch influenced religious thought far beyond the communities that eventually kept it in their Bibles. Interpretation begins where the surviving evidence leaves room for debate. Faith asks different questions still. Faith may ask whether Enoch's visions reveal spiritual realities, whether the watchers are literal beings, whether the judgment it describes is future truth, sacred symbolism, or both. And speculation goes further. Sometimes it can be imaginative. Sometimes it can be entertaining. But speculation should never be confused with proof. That is the line worth remembering. The Book of Enoch is mysterious enough without forcing it to say things it never says. It does not give us a scientific record of alien visitors. It does not provide archaeological proof of giant civilizations. It does not unlock every secret hidden in Genesis. What it gives us is something arguably more valuable, a direct encounter with an ancient world struggling to explain why evil exists, why knowledge can be dangerous, and whether justice can reach even the powers of heaven. Maybe that is why it still feels alive. The Watchers are still descending. The giants are still rising. Enoch is still looking into forbidden places. Not because we are trapped in an ancient story, but because the questions behind that story have never gone away. Who has the right to power? What happens when boundaries are broken? Can knowledge heal, or can it corrupt? Is evil merely human, or does it feel larger than us? And when the official books have spoken, are there still voices at the edge of tradition worth hearing? Enoch survives in that edge, not fully inside, never fully gone. A text preserved by faith, recovered by archaeology, debated by scholars, and rediscovered by every generation that senses there may be more to the ancient world than the familiar pages reveal. If this journey into the Book of Enoch gave you something to think about, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves ancient mysteries. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.